Okay, good evening. My name is Scott Marshall, and I'm Chair of the Environmental Quality Commission. I'd like to welcome you to tonight's Environmental Quality meeting. I will say that this is new for all of us commissioners. It's quite a large meeting, and we are happy and excited to be here, but we are new in this position, so we might need a little bit of warm-up on this. I'd like to, we look around the diocese, and I see all of our commissioners are here. I see Rebecca and Tom and Ryan and James and Janelle and Deb, and once again, Scott Marshall. I will call this meeting to order. It is 6:18. So this is a few housekeeping rules about this meeting tonight. Sorry, getting used to that. So this issue is one that everybody has a passion about. Everybody in here, of course, has a feeling about trees in Menlo Park. Our city emblem is a tree, so there's a lot of feeling about this. I would like to say that please respect other people's comments. Please don't speak out when you're not at the podium, and the format is going to be like this. The staff will first make a presentation about 10 to 15 minutes. Then the permit applicants will be allowed 15 minutes to make their presentation. After that, the appellants will have 15 minutes. And after that point, we will have public comment. You have all filled out your cards. Anybody wants to make a public comment, that's great. It looks like there will probably be three minutes, and we'll have a timer set up behind me. You will see that. Once again, as I stated before, if you heard someone get up there and make some comments and you're going to say the same thing, you could come up and say, I agree with my previous resident of Menlo Park. That'd be great. After the public comments are done, then the commissioners here have an opportunity to have a discussion. We also then could ask questions to the appellant. We could ask questions to the applicant. We will discuss things among ourselves. That is not a time where members of the audience come in and but would actually interject into our conversation. It is a discussion between us, and we can ask questions of other people here, but it is not a open forum in that way. After that discussion, we might make a motion, and then we'll have a vote on that motion. The EQC, after the decision is made, it can be appealed for up to 15 days after that date. So I want to fill you in on that. I would like to say that we have several people here from different groups. We have our city arborist, Christian Bonner. We have our city inspector, Bonna, and I don't know your last name, sorry. We have the staff liaison, Rebecca Lucky. I'm going to miss some people, but I also know that we have some engineers, and we have some city residents, and we have some arborists, so we have a lot of people who can help us out. Okay, well, I'm going to turn it over to the city for their presentation, and thank you very much.
Good evening, commissioners and members of the public. Just to quickly, again, introduce the staff. So at the end of the table here, we have Katie, who is our planner, Christian, our city arborist, Banna, our acting building official, and myself, the sustainability manager. And we have all taken part in authoring this staff report, so that's why we're all up here to answer any technical questions we may have. I'll be giving the presentation, the high-level overview of it. So before you tonight is the 1000 El Camino Heritage Tree Appeal. So just to give you a little bit of background on the project, so the building at this site was built in the early 1980s, and it's a very old building, so there are some things that need to be repaired on older structures, and in this case, there is water damage occurring to the building supports that are located in the underground parking garage ceiling, known as cables or tendons, and they need prompt repair. In addition to the repairing of the cables, there needs to be a waterproof barrier installed so that to prevent future damage and having the same situation occur. And so waterproof barriers, from what I understand from BANA, is that they go out over a certain amount of time. Just like a water heater, it goes out over a certain amount of time. So it served its life over the last 30 years, and a new waterproof barrier is needed. So the middle picture here shows some of the water damage that's occurring. And then the picture on the right shows some visual of the parking garage and with the structure and the trees that are located behind it, the redwood trees. So the reason for requesting the tree removals was that in order to do the repair work and also install the waterproof barrier, it would basically occur within the major root zones of the trees. So in this picture on the bottom here, if you see some of the trees proposed for removal, on the other side between the trees and the building is where there are a lot of roots. And these pictures on the right show the coverage of those roots. So when the permit applicant came to the city requesting the removal of the trees, staff did request that they do some excavation because we wanted to see the extent of the root system and whether or not there could be alternatives and kind of to understand the damage that was occurring to the waterproof barrier and to the building. And so just to give you an idea of kind of what are the standards for performing repairs or development work within the tree's root zone. So arboricultural practices recommend that in order to maintain the tree stability, that no work occur within 3 times the diameter of the tree. So in order to do this work, they need to dig trenches, and that would definitely occur within 3 times the diameter of the tree's trunk. So the tree history at the site, preservation and replacements. So these 7 redwood trees that were requested for removal, redwoods, were planted voluntarily by the developer in the 80s. The original plans had birch trees as the proposed trees planted. And on the site, on or near the site, there are at least 76 trees, and 40 of those are heritage trees. And when the permit applicant originally came to the city, there were plans to remove potentially more trees to do the repair work, but we were able to work with the permit applicant on preserving more trees on the site so that they could continue on with their life. The tree replacement for this project for commercial development is a 2-to-1 replacement. So for every tree removed, 2 trees are required. So in this case, 14 replacement trees would be required. And the proposed replacement trees are a mixture of Brisbane box, coast live oak, London plane, and birch trees. And so the pictures below show the redwood trees when they were young and where they are today. So the project approval process and the appeal process. So how this all came about was this project was presented to the Planning Commission in October, and it was approved by the Planning Commission. And then in December, the request for the removal of trees was conditionally approved given the appeal period. So there's a 15-day appeal period. And notices were put on the trees, as you see in this photograph here. And at that time, it was close to the holidays, and there was a lot of community members that were raising concerns and questions about the tree removal. So in January, early January, staff hosted an informational meeting to provide the reasoning or the rationale for approving the tree removal. And the community raised lots of concerns about potential alternatives that could be explored. And as a result, an appeal was filed to explore alternatives that are feasible and reasonable that could preserve the trees. And so essentially the appeal was filed on that grounds. So as the appeal process unfolded, it involved staff members from 3 departments that you see up here: Community Development, Public Works, and the City Manager's Office. And after the informational meeting and after the appeal was filed, staff explored looking at 5 alternatives to evaluate based on the feedback that was provided at the January meeting. And then there was also a decision made to hire an independent structural engineer and an arborist to provide some peer review of the proposed project and of the alternatives submitted by the applicant. In late February, staff met with the appellants to give them an update on the alternatives that we were thinking of exploring or looking at based on the January meeting, just to make sure we were aligned. And at that time, we also requested if there was any additional alternatives that they would like explored, that they submitted to the city by March 4th. And they did submit one alternative at that point. And our peer reviewer, our structural peer reviewer, also submitted an alternative as well, and I'll talk about that a little bit later. So then in March, city staff, the permit applicant, and the appellants and our peer reviewers all met in the same room with a conflict resolution specialist to just talk about where we were in our current findings and to make sure, that we were clear moving forward before the EQC meeting. And that meeting was very helpful because it helped us understand the alternative that the appellants were proposing in a more clear manner. And it also resulted in submitting another alternative after that meeting to explore. So the analysis of the alternatives, in total, 8 alternatives were analyzed. And the way they were analyzed was one, to make sure that the alternative not only had the ability to preserve the tree, but also maintain overall good health of the tree. And the second kind of criteria was, are there any legal restrictions or violations of other local, state, or regional codes, regulations, or rules that would be violated in implementing that alternative? And then the third was making sure that prompt repairs or a new structural support system could be done within a few months' time, again, to reduce the life and safety risk that's needed to make sure that the building is structurally sound. And that the cost alternative in relation to the value of the trees, to have that conversation of, what is the cost of the alternative versus the value of the trees. And so on that piece of information, we asked the permit applicant to supply to us, what is the total value of the redwood trees? And there are appraisal standards that are used by arboriculturists throughout the state, and Christian can speak more to it, but they are based on industry standards, and the 7 redwood trees were valued at $157,000 and $500. So the 8 alternatives that were explored, one was to abandon the parking garage and build a new parking structure. So the text here is highlighted in red, which relates to how the analysis, how they were evaluated. And so for the first 2, there were definitely just legal restrictions or code restrictions that wouldn't allow that alternative to proceed to even look at the feasibility of it. And I don't want to I do have extra slides if people want to explore that some more. But again, there were legal restrictions. For example, the parking structure where it would be located would be on a San Francisco water pipeline, and you cannot build any structures on top of that. So that's just an example of what that looks like. So the next 3, 4, 5, and 6 had to do with making sure that we're not only preserving the trees, but making sure that the health of the trees maintain. And in all of these options, pretty much it still required trenching into the trees' major root zones, so they became unviable options as a result. So, and that even included the 6th option, which was to brace the trees to the building, and that was submitted by our structural engineer peer reviewer. So then we were left with the 7 and 8 options, which were submitted by the appellants, and that's to remove existing parking spaces and add walls to provide new support to the building. And then number 8 is a modification of 7 by increasing the width of the existing columns in the parking garage to provide more support. So we'll explore those in the next few slides. So remove the parking spaces, remove some parking spaces and adding walls. It wouldn't require any trenching or installing a waterproof barrier. So the appellant submitted a design where the water could be diverted, and it provides the additional support. It does remove parking that is required for this development, and what we found is we would need to work through how to remove that parking in a way that still supplies the needs of that development. The other issue with it is that the work doesn't align with standard engineering practice, which makes it very costly. And the permit applicant estimated that it would cost 7 to 8 times more than the project proposed value, the existing project that was approved, which was valued at $1 million. And that they were also concerned that they'd have difficulty finding an engineering firm to take on a project with the current market conditions. We did have our peer reviewer, structural engineer peer reviewer, review this information, and they concurred that they agreed it would cost at least 7 to 8 times more, and that it would be very hard to find a firm to take on the project. It also would require relocating tenants, which could result in losing tenants as well, so it has an economic impact to that alternative, and it could have legal implications in the lease agreement. So the property is owned by the city, and it's leased through chunks of time. The last lease is for 50 years. So this alternative is not recommended due to the infeasibility and the parking changes that would delay prompt repair of the building. So the 8th alternative, which is to widen the parking columns, is similar to 7 but has less complexity. It would still require some parking to be removed and would still be costly. The main issue that we were finding with this alternative is that you would still need support between the columns, which would essentially require this similar type of work of repairing those tendons and having to do the work required on top of the parking garage to get to those tendons. So this alternative was also not recommended due to its infeasibility. So the conclusions and recommendations. So again, the peer reviewers found that the quality of information that was submitted by the permit applicants was sound, and they concurred with their major findings. The heritage tree ordinance requires staff and other decision-making bodies to make removal decisions based on 8 criteria. 3 of the 8 criteria were used to evaluate this decision. One is the condition of the trees with respect to disease, danger of falling, and proximity to existing or proposed structures. And so this criteria is really used because of the repair work that's needed. Because you're removing a major portion of their root system, it would make the tree more likely to fall or be more susceptible to disease. And for the third one, the second one is the necessity to remove trees in order to conduct improvements. So that was pretty straightforward. They need to make repairs, so the trees need to be looked at for removal. And then the third is the availability of reasonable and feasible alternatives that would allow the preservation of the trees. And then that becomes really always the gray area for evaluating projects like this, because what's reasonable and feasible to one person is different to another person. So we try to use some of the criteria I described before on what would seem reasonable or feasible. And that's, again, ability to preserve the trees and still maintain good health, any legal restrictions or conflict with other rules and regulations, and making sure that prompt repair occurs on the building, and that the cost of the alternative seems reasonable in comparison to the value of the trees. And so based on the information and the evidence submitted to date, staff has not been able to identify a reasonable or feasible option or alternative and recommends that the trees be removed. So, and just for the EQC's determination process, when you're making the findings, again, it's in accordance to the 8 decision-making criteria, so it's helpful for everybody just to be on the same page with that, and address the appeal request to determine if there are any options that are feasible and reasonable. And just to kind of provide some guidance on the discussion is, really the 2 options is, does the commission find that one or more of these alternatives are reasonable and feasible? If so, which ones are they? And why does the commission deem them feasible and reasonable? Or the other option is, does the commission find there is no reasonable or feasible alternative? If so, why? Thank you.
Thank you, Rebecca. We will have a presentation from the applicant, but first I'd like to say to my fellow commissioners that we could ask a clarifying question if it's simple, possibly where's north and south on these drawings or something, but we're not going to get into any discussion until after public comment. So with that, then I would like to ask the representative of the applicant come up and make the presentation. Thank you, and you have 15 minutes. Thank you very much.
Good evening. I am Matt Madison. I was raised in Menlo Park, and I raised my two children also here. It's my family who planted the trees and built this building in 1983. As both manager of the building and a part owner, I have personally been intimately involved with this property for 37 years. This discussion has been characterized as a battle between those who love trees and those who do not care about them. That could not be further from the truth. I love these trees, and I have spent the last 37 years professionally caring for them. In fact, I have an emotional attachment to these trees as much as any of you in this room. We planted all 76 of the trees on this site, as there were no trees when we began the project. Personally, I'm extremely disappointed to have to take out any of them. Fortunately, as the staff report indicated, with a significant amount of work, we have been able to limit our tree removals to only these 7 trees. We first discovered water intrusion into the structure and the failure of some of the structural components in early 2014. We've spent over 5 years examining the causes of the waterproofing failure and the structural damage that resulted by analyzing dozens of remedial alternatives dedicated to finding a way to save as many of our trees as possible while solving our safety issues. Our conclusions are based on established science and experienced in professional engineering. Given the complexity of this task, we sought the assistance from the best consultants and contractors that we could find. Importantly, this has now become a critical health and safety issue, and the structural and waterproofing repairs discussed by staff are both urgent and non-discretionary. The slab structure in question supports the entire building and the landscape plazas at grade level. This slide shows a picture of the full site. And you should note, no, back a slide please. You should note that the entire area you see there is actually covered by the slab. So it is not just covering parking, it's underneath the entire building. Okay, next slide. Now you see it with the slab poured. The slab is the white area where you see underground garage, but it is over the entire site and underneath the first floor of the building. If you look at the trench on the left, you'll see that is where we need to get back to get to the edge of that slab so that we can check all of the steel structural cables that run to that point. Key components of the slab structure have suffered water intrusion, resulting in destructive rust of these components, and in at least 3 known locations, these structural components have failed. Importantly, this cannot continue without the progressive and ultimately catastrophic failure of the building structure, endangering the employees of the office tenants and their visitors. We are required to repair the building with industry standard, professionally defensible, and certifiable methods in accordance with all applicable codes and in accordance with the provisions of our ground lease with the City of Menlo Park. The work must be designed to ensure structural integrity and waterproof conditions for decades to come. Some might question why this is so urgent when it has taken us 5 years to reach this point following discovery of the damage. Clearly, this is a very complicated and time-consuming process with many critical steps needed to comprehensively and responsibly proceed. In 2014, the ground lease with the city had a remaining term much too short to enable us to obtain the financing we would need to provide significant funds for these repairs, well in excess of $1 million, not including consulting fees. This ground lease extension process, by the way, took 2 years. So now we're up to 2016. We and our consultants needed time to analyze the project and all its possible alternatives to solve the safety issues while protecting the trees. The process of securing a new mortgage loan that would provide the required funds took several more months. We then commenced the lengthy city approval process, which included more months of staff analysis and the formal Planning Commission approval and hearing process. That took over a year. That process concluded in October of 2018 with Planning Commission approval. This tree removal permit appeal process has now delayed us for an additional 5 months. During all of this time, we have remained urgently concerned about the continuing deterioration of the post-tension slab components due to water intrusion. This deterioration clearly continues with the discovery of the third post-tension failure just 3 weeks ago. Unfortunately, tendons can fail without outwardly visible signs, so we may have far more cable tendons that have failed than we know about today. The only way to be certain is to inspect all of the tendons at the post-tension slab edge, a key purpose of this project and one of the main reasons the trees must be removed. Importantly, we derive no financial benefit from this repair and restoration process. The only benefits are ensuring that water no longer leaks into the structure and that the structure itself is repaired and restored. We will gain no additional rentable space and our rents will not increase. It's also important to note that the highly visible and commanding heritage trees along the entire Ravenswood frontage shown in this slide will be left undisturbed. In fact, these are the largest trees on the site. Two key factors define this project: the design of the structural system and the waterproofing process. To explain these fundamental factors, our structural engineer and our waterproofing consultants will briefly provide an overview on these topics. Greg Wagner is a structural engineer with KPFF in San Francisco. KPFF has over 25 years of experience working on numerous post-tension cable design and repair projects. Kareem Alana is the founder and principal of Alana, Buick & Burrs Waterproofing Consultants and Engineers. Kareem is the preeminent expert on commercial waterproofing on the West Coast.
Good evening. Today I'm going to talk a little bit about the post-tension slab, just to give a little bit of background.
I'm sorry, could you give me your name again?
Yeah,
and you're representing...
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm Greg Wagner. I'm with KPFF, the structural engineer.
Thank you.
So I'm going to talk a little bit about post-tension slab. PT slabs are used throughout the San Francisco Bay Area, and they're used for supporting existing exterior landscape courtyards, similar to the ones what we're talking about today. On the screen is the ground level slab plan. This is the slab that actually occurs above the basement level, and the tendons are actually color-coded to kind of indicate the amount of tendons we're dealing with. It's really difficult to see the colors. I apologize for that. But in red is the tendons along the column lines. These are the main supports. And this is where there's heavily concentrations of tendons. Each line is about 30 tendons. In green is between the, thank you. In green is between the columns, and they're single tendons. In blue, perpendicular to the red, these are groups of tendons that are about 3 tendons at 3 feet on center. There's about 150 cables. So really what I'm trying to show is like how many tendons we're really talking about throughout this whole slab. In pink, in particular, in the bottom left and up on the top, these are the 3 currently known failed tendons. Next slide, please. This represents a simple section cut of the slab, which really indicates how the post-tension tendons support the slab. You know, in essence, tendons really act like a giant rubber band. What you do is at the edge of the slab, the tendon is pulled to approximately 30,000 pounds, and then it's anchored off at the edge of slab. You know, to give a context, 30,000 pounds is approximately the same as like the weight of 6 Ford Expeditions. So it's a fairly large load. You know, and so when the tendons are, when tendons or anchorage fails, the concern is with these 30,000 pound load, it has to let go. And so there's concerns when these tendons let go. So what you see on the screen now really is the anchorage zones that we've been talking about. So on the left is really where the tendons are pulled prior to cutting off the excess tendons. And what you see there is you see the anchorage zones and these grout pockets. The photo on the right is really an example of water intrusion at one of the anchors. And so when water gets into one of the anchors, it tends to rust. And so the water intrusion into the anchorage is really detrimental and leads to potential failure of the cables.
And I'm sorry, is this photo on the right of the site, or is this of another?
It is not of the site. We couldn't get access to them, so we've basically tried to get one that's a representation.
Thank you.
You're welcome. And so really, the whole point of this discussion really is making sure we have access to the cable, the anchorage zones to ascertain whether or not there's rust. I'm happy to discuss the techniques involved with inspection and repair of the cables, but I'd do that in the Q&A session. Thank you. Kareem?
Good afternoon.
And you'll probably have to pull the mic up all the way. Thank you. And your name and who you represent.
I'm Kareem Alana with Alana Buick and Burrs. I'm representing the owners of this project.
Thank you.
This slide here shows the hatched area where the actual podium is. This is the area where it's a garden area. There's lawn as well as trees and other plants in this area. And you can see in circles where the redwood trees are adjacent to this podium area. In this slide, you can see where the root zones are. Where the primary root zone is right on top of the podium. Because redwood trees have shallow roots, they've grown right on top of the podium. And the primary roots are actually growing directly underneath the lawn, which is on the podium. So to waterproof the podium slab, the post-tension slab, we've got to get access to the concrete. We've got to get down there, we've got to remove these, and we need a clean area to waterproof. This slide on the right-hand side, the photograph shows just how fine these roots are and how pervasive they are and gotten underneath the waterproofing membrane to damage it. Waterproofing this area is akin to painting a surface. So you need the area to be completely clean and all of the roots and everything has to be completely scraped clean. And B, the concrete has to be bone dry. So there's layers and layers of waterproofing that go on, and you really can't accomplish this with all of the root structure that exists on top. So you've got to take the root structure out. The next slide shows how the roots have spread. You can see how the roots have spread on top of the podium, where the symbol of the man is standing at the top. And you can also see how they've grown down adjacent to the below-grade wall. Both the horizontal post-tension slab and the below-grade wall need to be waterproofed because they're both leaking, they're both structural in nature. The wall's actually holding up the slab, and we're getting damage, continuous damage from this. So it is really important to get this zone repaired. On the left-hand side, you can see that's how much excavation we need to get to the entire wall. On the right-hand side is the bare minimum excavation we need to complete the waterproofing from the podium to the slab wall.
1 minute warning.
And the problem with this is that both of them will destroy the trees.
Thank you.
Is that a 1 minute warning on the 15 minutes? Oh, wow. Okay. After studying the alternatives, our consultants, the peer review consultants hired by the city and the city staff, unfortunately determined that none of the alternatives are feasible. To be clear, in our view, to be feasible, an alternative must satisfy all three of the following criteria. They have to allow for the complete inspection and the proper repair of the structure, allow for the comprehensive waterproofing of the structural slab and the basement walls to protect the structural components, and they have to ensure that any trees that remain are healthy, have a likelihood of remaining so, and are not at significant risk of toppling from weakened root structures and wind forces. The peer reviewers all contain, our consultants and the peer reviewers all have extensive discussion of all the options, so you can ask them questions. It's also in your materials. But in conclusion, I need to state that we believe the appellants are well-intentioned. Unfortunately, they lack the knowledge and consultant expertise necessary to address the complexity of these issues. From an emotional standpoint, all of us appreciate the trees on this site, and unfortunately, some of them have to be removed, but most of them will remain as we see them today. This is not a decision that can really be based on emotion. We and the city staff have based our analysis on highly qualified and respected consultants who are specialists in the fields critical to this project, including 2 different structural engineers, 2 highly respected arborists, and the preeminent expert on waterproofing. All have concluded for various reasons that there are no feasible alternatives to our proposed project. On the other hand, the appellants have no qualified or reputable consultants in any of these specific professional fields who have analyzed these issues and can credibly refute any of the conclusions made by our consultants and the city's peer review consultants.
Time's up. Thank you. I mean, please.
What? Oh, okay. Our consulting team's available to answer any questions. We request you concur with staff
We will
recommendation.
probably ask questions at our discussion. Thank you. All right. Now we are going to have the appellant give their presentation. And please identify yourself when you come up. And thank you very much.
Let me know when my 5 minutes are up. Okay, yes. Okay, thank you. We will start now. Okay, hello everybody. My name's Judy Rocchio, and what I'd like to do in the first part of this 3-part presentation is to provide you with the context for telling the story of these 7 heritage redwood trees and convince you why it's important to preserve them. Then Peter Edmonds will take us through the second part. He'll be talking about his concerns with the project, and Jen Maison will be providing closing remarks. And you'll recognize, what is the Q&A doing up there? I've got slides. I've got really nice slides. I'm going to turn this off for a second because my slides aren't up.
Yes. Thank you.
So,
What's that?
does anybody know where my slides are?
Yes, we'll give you some more time. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you, because this is definitely not our slides. But I will take this time to say that there are 2 themes that you'll notice through all 3 parts of our presentation. The one theme is that the city's permit to remove the 7 heritage trees, okay, I'll go ahead and start now. They were based on false premises. And then the second theme is that the city has underestimated the value of the trees. And so with a more realistic value, it's easy to see that how these trees should be protected for the long haul. Think of your grandchildren and your grandchildren's children appreciation of these trees. Next slide. So I guess I can do that? Okay. Whoop. Oh, I guess you do it. Okay, fine. So looking at the big picture, some background, consider the number of dead trees in California today. The red on this map indicates drought-related tree mortality. According to the Sierra Nevada Conservancy, there are over 200 million drought-related tree deaths since 2010. And I'd like to make a case that every healthy tree is important in the age of climate change, but redwoods are even more so because redwood forests store at least 3 times more carbon above ground than any other forest species on Earth. Okay, next slide. Now, here in Menlo Park, trees are being cut down at an alarming rate. In 2018 alone, 700 heritage trees were chopped down. Those were the approved ones. We don't know how many were not approved. In 2017, we also lost dozens of our heritage redwood trees on the cloverleaf that is the Willow Road exit on 101 due to the major reconstruction of the overpass. This forever changed the small-town, peaceful vibe we used to get when we exited the freeway into Menlo Park. It's even worse than this slide shows because since the image was taken, all vegetation has been removed and about 4 more lanes of concrete have been added. Okay, next slide. The 7 redwood trees are located in the heart of Menlo Park. Here are a few of the statistics for those trees. Its species is the Sequoia sempervirens, coastal redwood. Their age is approximately 40 years. Their height currently is 85 feet, but if allowed to grow through their lifespan, they could reach up over 360 feet. Average diameter today is 35 to 40 inches. They could grow to be 24 feet in diameter. And then the average life expectancy of the trees is between 500 and 700 years. An old Redwood is 2,000 years old. And then an average number for carbon sequestration that I was able to find was that one old redwood could store up to 800 tons of carbon. Times 7 is 5,600 tons of carbon. Next slide. So there are many obvious reasons why we want to preserve the heritage redwood trees, and these few examples just weigh heavily in their favor. The carbon sequestration potential, the neighborhood and downtown beauty, air and noise pollution, habitat and numerous species, calming effect, increased property values, vital for a Tree City USA, etc. Next slide. So this is a copy of the memo that Christian Bonner, the city arborist, sent to Katie Medor, the city planner, dated April 4th, 2018, regarding the heritage tree replacement application at 100 El Camino Real. In the memo, Christian states that he is approving the heritage tree replacement application based on two criteria, Criteria 1 and Criteria 8. Criteria 1 says that the condition of the trees with respect to disease, danger of falling, proximity to existing and proposed structures, and interference with the utility services is false. The trees are currently not diseased, not in any danger of falling, not within proximity to existing or proposed structure, and they do not interfere with utility services. As a matter of fact, they are healthy and thriving. And criteria number 8 said that availability of reasonable and feasible alternatives that would allow the preservation of trees or the reasonable, feasible alternative of removing the trees, that's also false. There are alternatives for repairing the building structure without endangering the trees. Next slide. So, this slide represents Peter Edmonds' design alternative that would save the building and the trees. Peter's options 7 and 8 would preserve all the trees. However, they would result in an increasing building repair cost and parking space reduction. We believe that the building structure repair solution should be designed around preserving the trees and not the parking spaces. And I just want to make a note here. All 8 of the alternatives that were looked at were provided by the public. Of course we don't know structural engineering. We expect the structural engineers to provide the alternatives, for heaven's sakes. The fact that it was the public that provided any alternatives to this is ridiculous. Okay, fine. Thank you. Okay, next one. So, my last slide. Sorry. Planted on city-owned land 40 years ago in the heart of Menlo Park, these 7 trees are both an invaluable asset to all of us and an invaluable legacy to the many future generations. Hopefully, I've convinced you that these trees are worth saving and that do not simply have a monetary value, but they are invaluable. Please, let's stand with the trees and preserve the environmental quality of Menlo Park. Thank you.
Thank you. Jen, you'd be next. Peter, thank you.
Thank you. Good evening. My name is Peter Edmonds. My wife and I have lived in Menlo Park for 42 years.
Excuse me, Peter, could you pull up the mic closer to your mouth? Thank you.
My name is Peter Edmonds. My wife and I have lived in Menlo Park for 42 years. And I'm retired from a position as a senior research physicist at SRI International on the next block. So you might wonder why I have the temerity to come before you and offer different suggestions from the applicants for the way in which they should deal with their property. If we can... do I control the slides, or who does? What? Yes, flip through to about slide 3, please. Before that. That one, thank you. Thank you, that one. So, if you think back to your elementary physics 101, you will have been treated, however unwillingly, to instruction in statics and dynamics. If you decided to pursue a career to exhaustive limits of statics, you would arrive at the profession of a structural engineer, and you would be able to design buildings such as the CCTV headquarters in Beijing that look as if it's very unlikely that it would be stable, but it is. If, on the other hand, you pursued a career related to dynamics, then you could study mechanical or elastic wave propagation in materials, and you can become a specialist in the technology of ultrasound imaging in medicine, which allows you to look at an unborn fetus and the structure of a beating heart, as shown in those diagrams. So the connection is moduli of elasticity, of which there are three, and if you want to define that, you can use any of the three options suggested underneath that term. Next slide, please. So this is a slide from the appellants, as they already said, and it emphasizes the fact that however long ago, 36 years ago, redwood trees were planted almost directly on top of the retaining wall of the structure, where the owners and their contractors must certainly have known that there were structures that were critical to the well-being of the building in the future, and namely these anchors for the post-tensioning tendons. Yet they put redwood trees, which are known to have a lifetime of thousands of years, immediately on top. So I would ask, if we are faced with extraordinary expenses because of the presence of these trees and their roots, who should bear the blame or the costs? I would say the heirs to the present owners. So my approach has been different from what you would expect to get from consulting engineers and arborists, which would be to try and restore the building to its original condition. On the contrary, my approach has been to say that the heritage trees are of critical value to the community, and what we should be looking at is what modifications are necessary to the building in order to preserve it as rentable property, while at the same time leaving these heritage trees undisturbed, because they are our valuable community property.
Peter, I think you have about 4 more minutes or so.
Okay.
Jen,
in that case, I will yield to Jen Mazin, and thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Peter.
If you could please skip to the slide with the balance. Hi, I'm Jen Mazzone. So city staff and consulting arborists have estimated the value of these 7 trees at $157,000 approximately. I think this valuation is at the root of the problem, pun intended. Why bother to spend more time and effort to devise feasible alternatives to repair a flawed building structure? Alternatives which will certainly require even more time, effort, and money to implement, if the cost will far exceed the estimated value of the trees. The reason that I offer to the Commission for bothering to spend more time and effort to devise feasible alternatives is that the value of the trees to our community is grossly underestimated. Per the Heritage Tree Ordinance, heritage tree preservation is, quote, necessary for the health and welfare of the citizens of this city in order to preserve the scenic beauty and historical value of the trees, unquote. How do you assign a dollar value to the scenic beauty that these trees provide? This land is owned by the city at the heart of Menlo Park and located at a major intersection that is 1 block from our city's public transit center. This location is incredibly central. If we value scenic beauty anywhere in the city, we should value it here. People love these coastal redwoods because they are beautiful, they are native to California, and they make us happy to live in this community. How do we assign a dollar value to that? Let's try. Let's be conservative. Let's take only 1,000 of the many thousands of people who pass by that tree every day. Let's value the joy of those people passing by these redwoods is worth only $1 per day. Then, assuming that it will take 40 years for any replacement trees to grow anywhere close to the majestic statue of the redwoods, which won't happen, by the way, we can say 1,000 people times $1 times 40 years worth of days. Next slide, please. That adds up to $14,600,000. This seems like a lot of money. However, this estimate is quite conservative, not only because we're only attributing joy to a small subset of daily passersby, but also because this calculation does not account for inflation, the net present value of that future tree value, and the increased value of the joy of each person passing by these redwoods as they grow more awe-inspiring the older they get. Next slide, please. Another critical issue is the subjective definition of feasibility. The ordinance states that an approval may or may not be given to remove a heritage tree depending on, quote, the availability of reasonable and feasible alternatives that would allow for the preservation of the trees, unquote. The top definition of feasibility is capable of being done or carried out. An alternative should be deemed feasible if it can be built as a matter of sound engineering judgment. The definition of reasonable is more subjective, in the eye of the beholder, so to speak. What is reasonable to the building developer is a cost and effort that will not eat into his profitability. What is reasonable to the community is a cost and effort commensurate with the value of the trees. Again, we are back to the value of the trees. Is it $157,000 or $14,600,000 or somewhere in between? Let's pick a number roughly in the middle. We get $7 million, which is the projected cost of solution number 7. Next slide, please. What outcome is in the best interest of the community of Menlo Park? What should we preserve and treasure at the heart of our community on public land? Does our community desperately need 29 underground parking spaces? No. Does our community desperately need this fatally flawed office building? No. Our community needs joy. Our community needs scenic beauty. Our community needs to preserve symbols of what makes our community special and unique, of our commitment to the environment, to each other's health and safety, and to our children's future. Please accept the appeal of this community to preserve these trees. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jen. Excuse me. Okay, it is now time for public comment, and we will, the cards are over. And we will have, your name will be read, and then there will be the person who is following that person, so you can prepare. And we're going to bring the cards up here. Thank you. And we will allow 3 minutes for each public comment once again. If you know you're going to reiterate what someone else has said, you can just go up and say, I agree with what my friend just said. Also, I will have my co-chair, Rebecca, call up the names. Thank you very much. Vice Chair, excuse me.
No problem. So the first name is Margaret Mullaney, and the second person to follow Margaret will be John O'Brien.
Thank you. I'm Margaret Mullaney, and I am representing the Raging Grannies, who are here to sing you a song. I hope you all have your song sheets.
The tune is the Marine Corps hymn, and if those of you who have lyrics and believe in our cause, please sing along. From the lovely town of Menlo Park comes a business person's cry. They must fix their building at low cost, even if some redwoods die. We've polluted the environment. We need trees to help us breathe. If we cut down the heritage trees, nature lovers all will grieve. Here's to health for you in Menlo Park, where we're proud to work and live. Named a USA city of trees, and it has so much to give. Mind the heritage tree ordinance. Let us keep our honor clean. You will always find us in the fight to defend the redwood trees. Yes.
Wow, thank you
I'd
very
also
much.
like to say that it's not our job to worry about the company's profits. And that's clearly, and it always is, what's first in their minds. It's our job to protect the public trees, and that's why we are out here. And I resent that he acts like we're a bunch of people who don't have enough education to understand what his fancy schmancy engineers have decided.
And I do, and I'm a scientist, and I would like to make a comment as a scientist. You know, we're on a floodplain, and as the floodplain gets worse, I wonder if we really can tolerate the unscientific, emotional attachment, bleeding heart attachment to underground garages. Underground garages are unsustainable. Trees are sustainable. Pick one.
And I don't know exactly your financial deal about the lease, but it is of interest that it's on city land. And my suspicion, you can confirm this or not, is that it was a pretty good deal for the building owner. So maybe they could give back to the community. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I would like to say it is wonderful that Menlo Park has so many diverse residents, and having a song in an EQC meeting is something I'd never experienced before. Thank you very much.
So the next person for public comment is John O'Brien, and he will be followed by Steve Purcell.
Good evening. My name is John O'Brien. I'm a resident here in Menlo Park. So I've got a couple of things. My biggest concern here is the city's, where the city's liability, what liability they're taking on as part of this process, right? We've got an applicant with consultants who have all, and peer review of the consultants, get a commission hearing and approval in October. And you made an earlier comment tonight that a 15-day appeal process for any motion that's adjudicated here tonight. It seemed there was 3 months of appeal process for the Planning Commission. What is the time frame the Planning Commission appeal is?
I'm sorry, it's just the process is the way it's laid out. So 15 days after this meeting will give anybody an opportunity to appeal.
So was the appeal process for the Planning Commission approval of this the same amount of time? Because to me it looks like 3 months.
Well, excuse me, but the process was started many months ago, and then there was more information. And so I'm sorry, the city has given time to both groups. So thank you.
So then the other thing I have is you've got a plan that's by the experts, the engineers that are going to have to sign off on it. Damage is continuing. Are you now assuming, as the city, assuming that liability while you wait through this process? That's my concern. You guys are taking on liability because the building is continuing to fail. And to date, I read the staff report. I didn't see a single alternative that has a structural engineer saying this is a feasible alternative. So by not allowing him to do the work, you're creating an opportunity for more damage to occur, which in my opinion is assuming liability. And that's my concern, that because you're placating a certain population because they're voting constituents, you're taking on liability that all of the city's going to have to pay for in the event something happens. Okay, so that's my concern, and I'm watching how this plays out, because I do believe the appeal period of the Planning Commission had expired, and the appeal came in, and you're hearing it. That's violating your own parliamentary procedure.
Thank you. Thank you for your comments.
So the next person is Steve Purcell, and he will be followed by Jane David.
Good evening. My name is Steve Purcell, and I am a citizen of Menlo Park for over 40 years. Glad to be here. Always will be glad. Symbols are important. Symbols send a message. Menlo Park has a signal, and we all know it. It is the drawing of a tree. Many years ago, Menlo Park inaugurated an ordinance that protected large trees from those who would remove them. This was a symbolic action and a message. And after many more years, Menlo Park went further and planted trees right down the middle of historic El Camino Real. It was not in Redwood City, it was not Palo Alto, it was Menlo Park, and its symbol was a tree. All of us remember that proud time. The results of that action, of that message, are enjoyed by all of us. Time has passed, and now the symbol is being tested. Some of us would allow degradation of the message, even though the symbol has been strongly supported many times over the years. How many citizens have been asked to review their plans, incur additional expense, and delay their projects to preserve and honor the symbol, the message? Those of us who this Saturday and Sunday spent time with signs beside the threatened trees heard hundreds of supportive automobile honks, thumbs ups, energetic waves, and we only heard one angry F word. We experienced the support of the symbol of the message. And now, as we all are more and more aware of the value of fresh air and beauty provided by our special symbolic trees, we need to remember that another symbol, the dollar sign, must be kept in its proper subordinate place. There are times when the dollar sign should be subordinate. There are times when the trees should rule. The symbol in the middle of Menlo Park sign is not a dollar sign. It's a tree. Symbols are important. They send a message. Thank you.
Thank you.
So Jane David is the next public commenter, and she will be followed by Desharna Greenfield.
Thank you for allowing me to address you from the perspective of a doddering old woman. I understand that I don't have an education in engineering, but I came here for reasons besides the fact that I love the trees. Forgive me if I step back in time. My father was born in 1907 in Bakersfield, California. His father was born in 1882 in Bakersfield, California. But my father had an incredible opportunity through his aunt to attend Cal. And he did, but he earned his way through Cal not only hashing, which according to him was quite an experience, but also driving a long-haul trucker, NorCal, SoCal. He drove through the redwood trees every year, every spring, every summer, and he loved them. I mean, my father was a die-hard Republican, a vet of World War II. He was a tough man, I'll tell you. But there were two things that he really respected and he really cared about. One was the redwoods and the other was the vets. And when he went with us at my sister's graduation from Stanford, when we drove up through the redwoods towards Hartsook, he was biblically sore of heart. He was so disturbed. I mean, he was practically distraught because of all the trees that had been gone. I mean, it was mowed down, the clear cutting. That hopefully is much in our past, but I do see a parallel between that kind of flagrant disregard of a living tree and what we're expected to do here on El Camino. Yeah, for the sake of progress, but for the sake of the financial enrichment of not all the people of Menlo Park by any means, but a small number. And I do respect private property, but this is not private property. This is also our property as people of Menlo Park. So I suggest that you approach the Cal and Stanford engineering departments and say, all right, bright boys and girls, you got a problem here. How would you solve it? Because I have seen engineering problems solved with our houses, which are on floodplains, from a very different perspective from what we've heard here tonight from the experts. And yeah, I'm all for expertise, but I'm also for innovative thinking, and I think you can get that. You need to turn these young people loose on it, because they are tomorrow, and they are the ones who are going to be looking at those trees 20 years from now and thinking, thank God those trees are still there. And that's all I have to say. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
The next commenter is Darshana Greenfield, and she will be followed by Angela Evans and her daughter Ella.
Thank you. I live in the Willows area of Menlo Park, and I'm Darshana Greenfield. So as reported erroneously in the newspaper originally, the problems with the tenant's garage was not caused by the trees. Apparently, it was caused by bad design in the initial building and bad landscaping for the design. And apparently it can be solved without their removal, with just more money. Building maintenance is a normal cost of doing business. These trees grow in the most visible corner of our city center, right next to the trees we light for the holidays, giving us joy and peace and demonstrate that we are indeed a tree city. The 7 trees absorb and neutralize tons of air pollution while giving us back clean oxygen. The statistics are pretty amazing about how much work they do for us. I pulled a couple articles. There are plenty more for anyone who wants to search. The trees were far undervalued, missing entirely the facts about oxygen, pollutant mitigation, CO2, carbon sequestering, wildlife habitat. You do know that living in a diverse ecosystem is required for humans who are at the top of the chain. They even undervalue the board feet these trees could be sold for, though I believe most trees cut in our city are chipped and shredded and not milled, and I sure don't want to see that happen to these gorgeous, healthy trees. Finally, and perhaps most importantly, not only do these trees process immense amounts of CO2, but they actually sequester tons of carbon in their trunk, needles, and root system. To deal with climate change, we are supposed to be planting more trees, not cutting down huge, mature trees, which are already working much harder for us. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Angela Evans and her daughter Ella are next, and they will be followed by Tim Norton.
Hello, my name is Angela Evans. This is my daughter Ella. She's 7. She really wanted to be here today, and she brought her copy of the Lorax. She'll hold that up there. I have 3 points that I'd like to make. First of all, thank you for letting us speak. First of all, so as my beloved environmental economics professor from Stanford used to say, the full cost of something must include the positive externalities or the externalities involved. And that is the wonky term for all these things that we've been discussing. The carbon sequestration, the joy that Jen quantified at almost $15 million, the scenic value, et cetera, et cetera. So it is absolutely not the $100,000. It is much, much more. Okay, and so when you're taking that into account and you're doing your quantitative analysis, please take those externalities into account. Second point is that, with all due respect to the developer, I am not here because this is an emotional issue. I am here primarily because climate change is an enormous concern, and it's science, and it's real. Okay, it's not emotion. And although 7 heritage trees and their preservation isn't going to solve the climate crisis, we all have to do meaningful steps in that direction, and certainly not the opposite. My third point is one that's also been made, but it's such a big deal and stands out to me so much that I have to say it, which is, as I'm listening to the engineers speak, and if the trees were planted on top of the structure, knowing that as these trees' root systems, which we've been told are shallow, will develop in such a way that they will compromise the safety and well-being of the structure, then that is a design flaw. It is a massive design flaw. And mistakes happen, but who pays for the mistakes? The developer or the climate in the community? The developer pays. Okay, that's the right answer. That's the way that we need to be looking at this right now. And so as we think about that, even if an innovative solution that allows for the repair of the building but does not compromise the trees is much, much more expensive, then we need to make sure that we move in that direction. That's okay that it's more expensive. It is more expensive. It was based on a design flaw. Anyways, thank you for your time.
Thank you very much, and thanks for showing us the book.
The next public comment comes from Tim Norton, and he will be followed by George Newtbar.
Hi, my name is Tim Norton. In July, I will have been a resident of Menlo Park for 22 years. I just wanted to say I think the most paramount issue is probably the safety of the people working in the building. And I think that's kind of been glossed over a lot, talking about engineering and trees. So just wanted to touch on that. And also, I went to school. I actually went to Stanford, went to high school in the area, of course. And when I think of Menlo Park, I also think of the people and, the oasis, the goose, all the spots that I've loved for so long. So I'd like to keep it safe for everybody. Thanks.
Thank you.
Next is Joe Newtbar, and he will be followed by Peter Edmonds.
Good evening, Commissioners. Happy to be here tonight. I'm a 17-year resident of Menlo Park and a lover of trees. I have a bachelor's of science from UC Davis in landscape architecture and work on projects regularly. I've read the staff report and reviewed the applicants' or the appellant's alternatives and the related documents. It is really unfortunate to lose 7 large coast redwoods. Definitely. But to try to force a property owner into unproven, outrageously expensive, and potentially dangerous structural engineering solutions to the adjacent garage and building is completely unreasonable. That doesn't even take into consideration the impact of the building's value and indirect but significant other financial impacts that we can't even quantify. In all of my experience of building projects and landscapes, the alternatives in the appeal do not make any reasonable sense. And I actually love trees. That is my business. Climate change. Given the forecasted changes in the climate, redwoods are not a very sustainable tree outside of their native habitat due to their water needs, let alone this kind of root oppressive, unnatural environment over structure. This is apparent in many nearby locations where during the recent years, as irrigation has been significantly reduced, coast redwoods have shown major deterioration and often failure. Often it's the turf grass that's being irrigated under the trees that keeps them alive. Go to the Santa Cruz Mountains, they survive. The trees in the Sierras that are dying, it's because they haven't had Mother Nature's irrigation. These trees require water. Arborists don't suggest using them, I don't believe, outside of their native habitat anymore. I don't suggest it. They use too much water. I'm concerned about our future, my grandkids' future. I think if all of us in this room went out and planted one tree that was an appropriate species for this neighborhood, coast live oak, for example, we could far outmatch the 7 trees that need to be removed here. I'm planning to plant a tree. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. So, Peter, we apologize, but your comment was part of your presentation. The other request for the members of the community in this meeting is to refrain from clapping or cheering.
Peter, you did have your presentation, actually.
I would like to point out that I asked to be heard at this time because I wish to respond to a letter which was submitted, and I'm speaking entirely independently of the matter which I was previously addressed. And I speak only as a resident of Menlo Park.
Okay, you're being timed.
And you'll find my letter, which I'm going to read, on the back of the material that I offered you at the beginning of the session. So a letter was submitted by the president of the Cortana Corporation, and it makes statements about assumptions about the ownership of trees, and I was stimulated to respond to that. I wrote, in his zeal to support his neighbor, the president of the Cortana Corporation conveniently overlooks the fact that in April 2004, the City Council of Menlo Park approved the Heritage Tree Ordinance number 928, whereby all trees in the city with trunk diameters greater than 15 inches at a height above grade of 54 inches became heritage trees, which are protected from removal if none of 8 carefully worded criteria provides good cause to justify removal. Ownership of the trees is not a factor in any of these criteria. Ownership of the trees is not a topic of dispute between the applicant for the permit to remove these 7 Coast Redwood heritage trees on the frontage of the 1000 El Camino Real and the appellants opposed to such removal. The dispute focuses on the 2 criteria selected by the city's arborist. Now it's 3, I notice, as his and the Planning Commission's reasons for tentatively approving issuance of a removal permit. And I mentioned criteria number 1 and number 8. The public meeting held on January the 8th elicited 5 suggestions of alternatives to heritage tree removal, as has already been stated, and 3 more were subsequently submitted to the sustainability manager. All were then discussed at a meeting of parties on March 13, and in my opinion, that discussion was too brief even to establish a common understanding of what was being proposed. Meeting of the Environmental Quality Committee today should provide a new opportunity to examine the proposed alternatives in depth with all interested and informed parties present. If time is insufficient to establish a consensus, as appears highly likely, then it is my earnest recommendation that the EQC consider that environmental justice can only be served by voting to approve a continuation of the current intensive efforts to determine whether or not a reasonable or feasible alternative exists to removing 7 iconic heritage redwood trees from the vicinity of the most heavily trafficked intersection.
Thank you very much, Peter.
In our community.
The next public comment will come from Maritza Longland, and that will be followed by Jeff Hardy.
Hi, so I'm wishing I had turned in another speaker card because I'm going to have to speak fast because I've thought of so many things while sitting here. Okay, so I live in Menlo Park in a property that I manage for my mother. She's the property owner. I own a small property in Redwood City. I bring this up because my property, when I bought it, had redwood trees on the property, and I did everything I could to save those redwood trees. One of them died during the construction, and I've been distraught ever since. These trees were literally the center part of the tree is like within 5 feet of where I had to, literally, life put me in a situation where I had to build a house. I knew nothing about construction, and I may not know all the lingo and the terminology, but I don't want my intelligence insulted, and I didn't appreciate the way you talked to us. Sorry, I get nervous talking in front of people. So I had to build a house. We had to lift the house off of its foundation. It was 1924. The foundation was crumbling. Okay, so we had to lift it off of the foundation. I have pictures of this on my phone if you don't believe me. We lifted it up, and they literally had to re-pour a new foundation. And they dug. So yeah, the redwood tree roots were probably cut then. And then worse yet, I figured out that we had drainage problems. The house was like, literally the land was sloping in toward the house. So we had to put in a drainage system. Again, the roots. We had to dig a trench, and the roots had to be cut. I brought an arborist out to make sure that, but he told me that the roots are going out, like even under the road and stuff like that. So I had a city inspector look at it, and I hired an arborist that I paid for because I cared that much. And I was able to save those trees. One of them died just because I was overloaded at the time and wasn't able to just keep going there in the midst of all the construction and watering it. And I regret that to this day. So, but I did everything I could to save those trees. I am like everybody else here. I think those trees provide a service that we can't do. We can't breathe CO2. And they provide beauty that we need. I disagree with Joe. Was that his name? Joe? Anyway, I think it doesn't matter that they were planted in the wrong environment. A birch tree is not going to provide the same amount of beauty. An oak tree with those caterpillars hanging from it, really? That's what you're proposing? I mean, oaks do not do the same thing for me that redwood trees do. Redwood trees are tall and majestic and beautiful, and everything should be done. I'm a landlady of that house in Redwood City. I would be encouraging my tenants to carpool more. Those anchors, you could drill holes with a camera and look at each one of those anchors if you know how far apart they are spaced. I don't need to know about construction to know alternative solutions for how to do that.
Thank you.
Thank you.
The next public comment will come from Jeff Hardy, and that will be followed by Angela Hayes.
I'm Jeff Hardy, and I've been a resident. I've lived in Vintage Oaks since 2005, and I didn't even think about coming here until noon today when I was driving home from Safeway, and I sat at the El Camino Real queue lane to turn right onto Ravenswood, and I'd been reading about this issue, and I thought, would I rather have one of those trees fall on me and impale me while sitting here in my car, or be in the building when it collapses on me when another post-tension cable snaps violently and causes other cables to fail? I think there's a reasonable third option that the building owner has proposed. That was my conclusion. What got me interested in this is the issue popped up on my next door feed, so I dug in. Since I've planted about 15 trees since buying our house, I've had to remove some of them for planting them in the wrong place. That has caused damage. It's tearing out a rock wall right now. And I had to remove 2 large tagged heritage oak trees due to property damage and life safety reasons. Those things fall on my house and get my neighbors and everybody else or in the street. I don't think my $5 million umbrella liability insurance policy is quite going to cover a couple of people dying. What struck me was the position that the building owner hasn't done enough analysis and research to determine whether the tree should come down and in a reasonable manner. After reading all the engineering, consulting, and arborist report, I couldn't believe the level of detail that they had gone through. And this is in comparison, and I went through the process of the $500 I had to spend for the analysis on my trees and the $3,000 to cut them down. I cried when the one in the backyard went down. But the plan for retreeing and landscaping the area, to me is very reasonable. This was also very detailed. And it includes ecologically friendly from a water consumption perspective. There's balances on everything for these trees. I tore out 2 200-year-old trees from my yard. These things have been there for 40 years. They are beautiful. They are majestic. I love every one of them. I see them every day. But I do think that the owner has gone above and beyond proving reasonable alternatives for taking care of the trees, public safety, his building, and the balance of the community. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
The next public comment will come from Angela Hayes, followed by Michelle Betchlum.
Hello, and thanks for all who have spoken and presented and pulled information. As someone who has a background in environmental science and several degrees on it, I understand that it is a complex issue and that there is something to be said about such a charismatic species. California, the coastal redwoods, is something that used to be in my front yard in my Menlo Park house. However, it was cut down recently, 3 years ago, I guess, for a construction of, for new construction. So I understand that here we have, as mentioned, charismatic species, but I want to mention that the 14 potential trees that would replace, how has that been considered? And I guess now, hearing that a lot of thought went in terms of the species that could better suit the area in terms of water usage, and reflecting that we are in a drought situation. We continue to have more of a growing population and the need for Menlo Park to consider what that growth looks like for me and my generation. So I wanted to just use my time to thank you guys all for everything that has been contributed tonight and previous to this. Thank you.
Thank you.
So Michelle Beachlum, and I apologize if I'm not pronouncing your Beauchamp. And you will be, Michelle will be followed by Henry Riggs.
Hi. So a lot of my comments have already been spoken tonight, so I'll just say that I see these yellow tree removal signs on so many healthy and magnificent heritage trees in our city, and it does make me question intentions, priorities, and values of Menlo Park. If we keep allowing the destruction of our trees, I fear we will lose what makes Menlo Park so special and so beautiful. I can't imagine that incredible redwood tree all lit up during the holidays on that corner of El Camino and Ravenswood, standing there alone from now on. I should hope the city will support conserving these trees and all the wildlife that resides in them over destroying them. I think we know the destruction of more trees is not a positive environmental solution, and I don't want to imagine what 1,000 El Camino will look like without them. Thank you.
Thank you.
Henry Riggs is next, and he will be followed by Charles Albanese.
Good evening, Henry Riggs, member of the Planning Commission, but speaking tonight on my own. First, thank you to staff for their thorough and continuing response to this threat to the 1980s redwoods. And thank you to the hearts and voices of the many people here. As a member of your sister planning commission, I saw this project many months ago, and the same turning feeling is in my heart as it was those months ago. As an architect, I'm required to know certain specifics of structural systems, how they work, why chosen, and importantly, at what risks. I recognize and must grant the description of the system and its potential full failure by the KPFF engineer tonight. I must also recognize the concern about waterproofing and the resulting in effect to a post-tension cable system. I'll share with you that waterproofing is the most frightening thing to an architect since it's a liability. Our commission was extremely hesitant to grant this approval as represented. I hope you know that the Planning Commission is a defender of trees, often challenging our own city arborist's tentative tree removal approval. Now, no valley engineer wants to hear that there may be intricacies that they don't intrinsically understand. I promise that that was true of the Planning Commission as well. Architects and other commission members discussed this issue and with regret approved the chosen repair process. We recognize the value of these trees. I have followed this issue since and have yet to see a better option. So finally, I would like to make a note that we have here a developer caught between a rock and a hard place who is truly trying to do the right thing as far as I can tell and from what I have read. I'd like to suggest that we should not penalize a developer for having planted trees on an empty lot years ago with less information then than now. We don't have the time machine, neither does he. I'm particularly concerned that future projects might see hesitancy to plant this many trees in the presence of a below-grade parking garage. So thank you for your consideration.
Thank you.
Following Charles will be Pasha Sadri.
Hello, my name is Charles Albanese. I'm a Menlo resident for 7 years, Menlo Park. This is an emotional and spiritual issue for myself. I'm a tree lover, and having lived in Redwood Grove for a year, I understand how the complexities and how they even create their own weather. It's really an amazing thing to live there. If you listen, you can. Sometimes they'll speak to you. If you can hear them in your soul, and if you can't hear them, you can hear what they do for the environment and for the people around you and for the ability to shade something. I was brought into this by the numbers and just doing some research in the internet. I came up with a value from Professor T.M. Doss at the University of Calcutta. I'd like to read to you. It's a living tree is worth, he values $193,000. For 50 years, it will generate $31,250 worth of oxygen, $62,000 worth of air pollution control soil erosion, increase soil fertility to the tune of $31,250, recycled $37,500 worth of water, and provide homes for animals worth of, he comes up with a $30,000 estimate. It doesn't include the value of fruits, lumber, beauty derived from the tree, and just another reason to take care of our forests. That was done in the 1990s, I believe. Now to speak on, I'd just like to read part of a poem or a posting from a horticulturist, Nancy Beckman, an Australian horticulturist, on trees. And of course we know that there's trees actually communicate with each other. Trees are clever. They can do arithmetic. They tell time. They display affection. They can align themselves according to the magnetic influence of the earth, predict changes in weather, and even produce their own rain. And I can attest to that. Like humans, they can survive fire, drought, floods, storms, hunger, loss of limbs. Trees are symbols of dignity, endurance, and adaptation. They fight back rather than give in. They have an irresistible urge to exist and to reproduce. And I'm running out of time. Thank you for listening. I just want to point out that they've been here for 300 million years, and humans have only been here for about 3 million. So I think it's kind of a travesty that we have to take out a heritage tree. And this study by the professor in the Calcutta, it's not a redwood tree. The redwood tree is the grandest thing we have on the planet. I think we need to protect them. Thank you.
Thank you.
Next is our last public commenter, Pasha.
Hi, everyone. My name is Pasha Sadri. I'm a Menlo Park resident. I just have two comments. One is about the $157,000 cost estimated value of these trees. I think we should be looking at the replacement cost, and I find it really hard to believe that the replacement cost of these trees is $157,000. I agree that they're actually invaluable because they're 40 years old, and it's really hard to. I do not think it's possible to get a replacement for these trees. The other one was something that I want us to consider. It's a hypothetical question. The trees are already here. Let's say the situation was that you were asked whether you were allowed to build a parking structure under these trees today. I think the answer to that question would probably be no. And therefore, I want us to consider that scenario more seriously, to sacrifice some of these parking spots. The building itself is very closely situated next to the Caltrain. People can probably carpool. There's plenty of parking spots available next to it, and I think that's it could be considered a reasonable trade-off to save these trees, which are worth a lot more than $157,000, and sacrifice some underground parking structure that probably would not be approved if it was requested to be built today. I guess I do want to make another side comment, which is several people came here and complained about or expressed concerns around the safety of the trees and the building. I'm sure if it was that serious, the building would already be vacated, and there are lots of other trees in Menlo Park, and we don't go around worrying about them falling on us. So I found that kind of funny that people were particularly concerned about these 7 trees. Anyway, thank you.
Thank you very much. That is the end of our public comment. Ask a question to my commissioners real quick. Is everybody ready? Anybody want a break or anything like that? Is that everybody fine? Everybody's fine? Okay, we will move forward. Okay, now what I'm going to have the commissioners do is we are going to, before we have a discussion session, the commissioners we're going to go down the line, and we're going to, if the commissioners would like to ask questions to city staff, the arborist, the permit applicant, so we can get some clarifying questions. We'll go through and ask our questions, and then among us we will have a discussion. But right now we're just going to go down the line and see if we have any questions that didn't get answered or we'd like clarification. And I'll start with Deb Martin at the end there. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Scott. And I will just confess I have a lot of questions, so I'm just going to start with my first one, though. And it's really kind of getting around the basis of the heritage tree evaluation. And I do want to, by the way, thank everybody and thank the staff for the thorough report. I probably read it 3 times over. I visited the site probably 5 times at different points of the day. I talked to both the appellants and the applicants. So I feel like I have I've tried, I recognize how important this is. I certainly recognize the gravity of this situation. I recognize that that's in the heart of our city. So everything you have said here on both sides, believe me, I've considered. So with that, I will ask my first question. Just as a process question, I did have confusion about the criteria 1, 2, and 8, and in particular criteria 1. Others have pointed it out, but I just, typically we look at the health of the tree as a criteria on its own before the alteration is done. So it's not to say, yes, they would be unhealthy after the potential works that was done. So I was not sure I really agreed with that, or maybe I misunderstood, because I think I saw a report from several arborists that said the trees were in healthy condition. So my first question is, are the trees as they are today in healthy and good condition, with not considering the work that's going to be done potentially?
The answer to the question is yes. The current condition of the trees is healthy.
Okay. Okay, and then I just have a subpart to that question, then I won't hog the mic, I promise, guys. So then really, I think criteria 2 and 8 definitely apply. I think when I read through this, so as criteria does state to look at alternatives. As far as I can tell, there was rigorous alternatives presented, but it seems to have been after the appeal, or after the complaints from the public. In which case, so I just first of all want to know if that's the timing of things, because my bit of concern is that we then are in a crunch situation to come up with alternatives, and I wanted to know whether there were any alternatives that were suggested up front so that you kind of pose the question ahead of time. Can we ask a firm to design a plan where the trees remain as a starting criteria? So can you please clarify that?
So the initial permit decision or recommendation was made based on the evidence that was provided, both on the evaluation of the condition of the trees, the impact, the proposed development, and the engineer's assessment.
Okay, so just to be clear, clarify then, options 1 through 8, was that presented in the original Planning Commission meetings, or was that after the public commented?
So those alternatives were focused primarily on alternatives that were suggested from the community after an initial informative community meeting that the city held to inform the public about the decision that had been made, the process that had been gone through, and to get feedback from the community. Most of those alternatives were presented after that meeting. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. And just one clarifying point to the public. I think there was a misunderstanding of the appeal process. We are the Environmental Quality Commission, and we received this package a week ago, and we're sitting here with this appeal for the first time. So I don't want to get confused with the appeal process and the Planning Commission work. So just please keep that in mind.
Thank you, Deb Martin. Now we will have Janelle London. Thank you.
Okay, and I echo Deb's statements about thanking all of you for being so conscientious about this and thoughtful. I have some basic questions about the building. So I was unclear if there is a new 50-year lease or 50 years remaining on the building, or it's currently under a 50-year lease. If that's the case, and this is not a new lease, when does that lease expire?
If Matt could answer that question for us, because that was through the city attorney's office.
And sorry, am I directing questions to anyone I want, or just?
Well, they're the lease.
I want to start with
ease, and so we don't know, but since he has the lease, he would know.
The lease was extended for 55 years in 2014. Okay, it had started out as a 55-year ground lease long ago when the building was first built, and it had only around 20 years left, which is why we had a financing problem, why it was extended. Okay.
So the current lease is a 50-year lease that began in 2014?
It's run for about 4.5 years,
right.
So it's got about just over 50 years left on it now.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. I was curious to know what is the average age of properties like this in Menlo Park? So properties that have been built in the 80s, about how long do they stick around? Because it looks pretty dated. Just curious.
So I'm just checking here with our planning manager, Deanna Chow. It varies, is what I'm hearing.
Yeah.
And we'd have to get some more information to give you a solid answer on that.
Okay.
Sorry.
And then in terms of carbon sequestration and energy efficiency, I'm curious to know the difference in energy efficiency of that building built in the early 1980s versus a new building under the current energy efficiency standards today.
Without looking all the Title 24 calculation, it's kind of hard to tell. But the building seems to be in a good shape overall.
And then I also wondered, has anyone done a study of, on average, how many of those parking spaces are in use each day? I went on 3 different days and counted at least 40 spaces unused.
So no applause, please. Thank you.
So staff doesn't have information on that. I don't know if the project applicant has done independent studies of their own on that.
And then I also wondered, kind of following up on that, if the tenants have been surveyed to find out if they use the parking, how often they use it, and what would happen if it went away.
No, that has not been done.
Thank you. I'll yield the questioning to the next commissioner.
All right, thank you, Janelle. And now we have James Price. I'm sorry, I have that wrong. Yes, James Payne, excuse me.
All right, well, Janelle, I was going to ask some of the same questions about parking, but thank you for asking those first. So I'll move straight ahead to a series of potentially naive questions about engineering. So I think these are towards the structural engineers. Is there a reason that the waterproofing needs to be installed above the cables and can't be locally, like, surrounding the cables or some sort of waterproof coating? Oh.
I'm sorry. Janelle, your mic is on. Oh, thank you, sorry.
They might have. Okay, sorry, can everyone hear me now? Did the engineers hear that question, or should I repeat it?
Let me try and answer the question. The cables are encased in the concrete, and so you can't. The only way to waterproof and to protect the cables is to waterproof the concrete itself.
But when you run new cables in, it's not possible to run in cables that have been surrounded with a waterproof coating?
So you can't even, right now, you can't even get to the cables to replace them. So in order to get to the cables, the trees have to be cut.
I believe I read in the report somewhere that it said that the cables could be accessed from below, but there would still be an issue with the waterproofing had to be installed from above. Does anybody remember that?
The cables can only be accessed from the side, the edge of the slab. And the edge of the slab is facing the redwood trees, and I'll let our structural engineer talk about that.
Just a quick, I think what you're getting at is the access to the cables is something like two feet down, or can you just specify where they are so we understand if you needed to access them, how far down would you need to excavate or whatever to get to that, to evaluate that?
Just to get to the cables themselves? Just to the cables themselves, okay. So we won't even pull up any images. The slab is 9 inches thick at the very edge of the building. The cables are exactly at mid-depth, so they're 4.5 inches down from the top of the slab. That's where they're anchored off.
Okay, but you're saying they cannot be accessed from below. They must be accessed from above.
So when you say accessed, the cables basically extend from one side of the building all the way to the other side of the building, and they drape up and down, up and down, up and down. And so to evaluate what's going on with the anchorage, you have to access the ends of where they're anchored at. And so the tough part about this question really is it depends on what's going on with the cable. So if you're going to replace a cable, there's a couple different ways you go about it. And so if the cable has failed at the actual anchorage itself, and there's not enough cable to actually repair, what you do sometimes is you can take the cable actually out. The cable is surrounded by sheathing. And so the sheathing is really what keeps the cable from degradation from water and things of that nature. But at the very end where it's anchored, the cable has to stick through to actually anchor it. And so if the anchorages have failed and the cable's not sufficient enough to re-anchor it, what you can do is you basically go to the other end and de-anchor it, and then you can take the whole cable out, and then you have to slip a whole new cable in.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
I think so.
Okay.
And then another, like I said, probably naive structural engineering question. So in the proposed plan the alternate plan to retrofit the building with steel beams, which would lower the clearance, people explored lowering the floor as well so that it maintains the necessary clearance?
So I'm not quite clear on your question. Let me attempt to explain that for option 2, whereby we were looking at taking and putting structural steel beams and girders underneath the slab to support the slab. That's the option you're asking
yes,
about?
And
okay.
My understanding is that one of the issues that was raised with it is that it would reduce the clearance below required levels for cars to access an underground garage.
Yep.
So I was wondering, could the floor not be lowered concomitantly in order to maintain the clearance required?
So the existing structural slab's at a set elevation. And so the thought process that we were coming up with was to come back and to be able to support that existing slab, we'd take steel beams and put them underneath the slab. And so the steel beam depth to support that slab were so deep that it would basically, you wouldn't comply with the minimum amount of head height clearances in the garage. And so the idea really was to keep the slab in place and put beams underneath to support it. I think what you're getting at, if I'm hearing you correctly, is was there any thought of actually getting rid of the slab and lowering the slab?
No.
Okay. Okay.
I was asking if those beams are installed on the ceiling of the underground parking garage, that lowers the clearance, but then could the floor itself be lowered accordingly?
Okay. So to actually lower the Okay, now I understand your question. Thank you. So the slab on grade in the actual parking garage it's like a 5-inch slab on grade, and it exists right above the actual footing. So all the columns come down. Let's say the columns are at approximately 27 feet on center. They have big footings underneath them, and they're right underneath the slab on grade. So for you to take and actually lower the slab on grade by 2 feet, you'd essentially have to take all the existing building foundations and lower them as well. And so that includes not only the building foundations underneath the columns, but the whole perimeter walls.
Oh, sorry, I believe I have one more question that hasn't been answered yet. This might not be for you, though. So the only site that appears to be discussed to make up for lost parking, if that is a necessity, is a parcel right behind the building, but have other options been explored? Or, I mean, you spoke to have the tenants been surveyed as to whether or not this parking would need to be compensated for, but have other properties besides the one on the public easement been explored?
First of all, I do need to clarify, this is not all about parking. So this slab supports the whole building. So there are things we have to do to keep it, intact. There are no suitable parcels anywhere nearby. We don't own any, but there aren't any available that could handle this. Furthermore, our tenants have a contractual right to parking underneath the building, which they've signed on a long-term basis, which I indicated in my materials. And so the problem we've got is I breach all the leases if I tell them there's no parking. So, we were asked to look at the site right behind, which would be logical, you would think, except it's got an SFPUC easement right through it, and we don't own the land, and it's not available. So for those reasons, we couldn't even consider the site behind the building. Does that answer the question?
I just have a follow-up question. I'm
Sure.
going to go out of order here, but it is pertinent. And we will get to the structural because I think that's the heart of things. So just bear with us on the parking.
Sure.
So one thing that was confusing to me is it doesn't make sense to try to build a parking garage behind you. However, I have also done a lot of observation of that parking lot, and what I see of the whole Menlo Station parking is a vastly underused area. We did receive a letter from the owner of that, which struck me as a little bit. It was just absolutely, we never share parking with you because of it's on a different property and those parking spots are rented. So, I just have to say on the parking issue, that sends a really bad message, and I don't really think this is about parking, but we can't really justify. It seems like there could be a feasible solution where a parking arrangement could be made with the other owner, where you could potentially rent back some of those unused parking spaces, which I would argue the current tenants of that space are, if they're being charged for parking spaces that are not being used, that doesn't seem fair to me either. So I really think there's a solution around parking, I believe, but I don't really think that's the heart of the matter. So I just wanted to make that comment.
Yeah. All right, thank you. That was the last of my questions, so I'll yield to Scott now.
Yeah, actually, I will work down the line and go to Ryan Price. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Echoing everyone's appreciation for all the members of the community as well as the appellants and the applicants being here tonight. I have a question for the applicant as well. I understand that you were aware of these issues when you re-signed the lease, is that correct?
We and the city were aware of the fact that we had a failure, and that one of the things we were going to have to do was to repair it properly. So we were going to need money, we could tell, but we couldn't tell how much, and we couldn't tell what the solutions would be. We just knew that with the short term of the ground lease at that time, we could not obtain a mortgage that would provide us funds to do repairs, certainly not at a magnitude like this. So the city was aware, we were aware. They could have said, no, we want to buy the site, or we want to just let the ground lease end. Instead, they agreed they wanted the revenue, the use was correct, and they didn't need the site for City Hall anymore. That was the original reason why it was leased and not sold. And so we entered into the extension, which enabled us to get the mortgage. Did I answer your question?
Yes.
Okay.
And my second question is, was the discovery of this damage to the building, how did that happen? Was it part of the renewal process, or was it a separate building inspection?
No, we actually, well, you can call it lucky. We were lucky that in the case of the first two tendons that failed, they failed visibly. As I mentioned in my talk, they don't always fail visibly. They can fail silently. The first two failed with visible cracks. And we do inspect our building often throughout the year, and we did notice them. And that's when we discovered that we had two tendons failed. And then at that point, we had to figure out, do we have just a local problem right around those tendons, or do we have a widespread problem with waterproofing failure? And that's what led to 5 years' worth of work.
Thank you. So I had one other question. I also observed some of the same things in my visits to the site regarding the use of the parking facility and the fact that a significant portion is being used for storage of furniture and other items in the underground parking garage. But my question is, if today this was a building and we were talking about structural repairs made with a building on top versus trees on top, how would that change this conversation?
Would you like me to address the furniture issue?
No, that's not a question. Thank you, though.
Okay. There's a logical explanation for it.
I'm not sure who is the best person on the city staff to answer my question, so I'm looking.
So just to understand the question, so
Sure.
how would this project proceed if the trees were not involved?
So if a similar type of repair was needed, but instead of above in our situation where you have trees and landscaping, if instead you had other structure, how would this conversation be approached? How would the repairs be approached?
If there was a structure where the trees currently exist?
Correct. Like if that was just part of the building, how would that be approached?
Go ahead.
Let me try and phrase the question how I think you mean it.
Sure.
So instead of having the ground level slab extending way out past the edges of the building, are you asking if the building actually went out to that actual edge?
Exactly.
Got it. Okay. So if I'm hearing you correctly, let's say for this hypothetical situation, the actual building extend out to the edge of the basement wall, and we still had a basement wall. Okay. So just to be clear, so you would still have waterproofing on the outside of that wall. That would be sufficient such that tendon anchorages still would not be being degraded with the water intrusion and rusting and letting go. And so if we had to repair it in that situation, it's really no different. You would basically go around the edge of the building. If it is indeed still a basement, we'd still dig down. We'd still pull back the waterproofing or whatever's left of it to expose all of the anchorages, and we go ahead and inspect every single one of them. And thereby, depending on what we see, like I talked about earlier, if we had to repair one and replace a tendon, you'd take the old tendon out and you can slide a new one in, and that would be the process. But it's much more involved. I'm trying to make it pare down, but to take an actual tendon out and actually put a new tendon in, you basically have to go in. Whenever you take tendons out, you're basically reducing the capacity of the slab. And so when you reduce the capacity of the slab, you have to temporarily support it before you put that new tendon back in. And so in essence, the repair detailing is you walk around, you find some that aren't, if some have failed, you basically say, okay, how many have failed? If it's one, you get a lot of load redistribution, but let's say it's multiple. So then there's a concern, if multiple tendons have failed, then there's the possibility for imminent collapse. And so what I would recommend at that point is you go in and you would shore the slab, and as you're doing the actual repair, since you're, like I spoke to earlier, you're putting a 30,000-pound load on this. You don't want anybody above the slab, you don't want anybody below the slab when you're actually putting this tension on.
And so then I have a follow-up question on what you had shared. So given what you said and given what we know about the situation where because we don't have access to the anchor points, we can't assess the damage to the tendons throughout the structure, it sounds to me like one of the issues is it's hard to know how much tension the building could support if you were even to remove some of the cables to begin with, because you don't know what the distribution would be like across the slab, given you don't know how many cables are in place versus how many might be impacted or impaired. And so it seems to me like it's harder to create other situations for repair when we're not really sure exactly what the extent of the damage is, and I think that's part of the safety concern. Is that correct?
That is exactly the concern. We do know that, like someone had spoken earlier, or I spoke, 3 cables have failed. We know that for sure. That and so I think I probably have to, if you humor me a little bit, I'll talk about some other indications that cables have failed.
Mm-hmm.
So sometimes what happens when a cable breaks, we've talked about this anchorage is at the end.
Mm-hmm.
And so at the end of the slab, if a cable breaks with that 30,000 pound load on it, sometimes it pops and it sticks out the edge of the slab. And when you walk the perimeter of the building, this is how we found the 3rd cable that broke.
Mm-hmm.
It actually was on a spot where it was not below soil, it was above soil. And so we saw that it had popped out the end. So it was an indication that the cable had broke. Oftentimes what we do with that situation sometimes is you'll take that cable and you can pull it out and measure it. Let's say it's 40 feet long. You go back into the building, you measure 40 feet, and you say, okay, that's where it broke. You can start looking at the slab to see what's going on. The other concern really is when a cable breaks, basically what you get is you get some load redistribution,
Mm-hmm.
okay? Because that one cable now is not taking any load, so the 2 adjacent cables, let's say,
Right.
now have an increased load. And so the concern, of course, is, okay, so let's say that cable breaks. So you get this kind of cyclic thing where each cable further and further along starts taking additional load that they weren't designed for. And so that's where you start getting concerned.
And so all of that said, I just have one follow-up structural question on this right now. So given all of that, would you say that there's a high level of concern that there could be structural, the extent could be much worse than what we understand today? And is that the concern about the elevated safety risk?
That is the concern. With the amount of, it'd be one thing if we had one isolated area where we saw water coming into the building, but there's multiple areas where water is coming into the building. And so when that water is coming into the building, there's really a couple main concerns from the structural standpoint. I'm only speaking to the structural concerns. Correct. So with that much water coming in the building, the waterproofing membrane has failed because you have water coming in the building. And so we focused a lot on the cables and the anchorages and stuff like that. And so I think everybody's very clear on that. The other concern we had is that these are all retaining walls. And so if you think about it from the standpoint of a retaining wall is retaining soil. So all this soil on the outside of the building is pushing against the wall. So the wall is connected to the slab by pieces of rebar that go from the slab down, and the slab really supports the top of the wall. So the other additional concern we have is the degradation of that rebar if water keeps pouring through at that because it's really that joint. It's the joint where the slab and the wall meet is where the water intrusion's coming in.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Go ahead. You can, while he's still standing, please.
Thank you. Okay, so I guess one concern this is raising for me is that somehow the trees get removed, and then you guys go in and you find, oh gosh, the structural damage is so extensive that we were going to have to take drastic measures anyway. And now we've lost a bunch of trees, and it doesn't matter because the structural damage was so great anyway that you're going to have to do whatever it is you have to do.
So I can only speak to the structural aspects of that. And so I think what you're saying is if we went in, let's say, we know that 3 cables have broken. So let's say if we go in, we take the trees out and we go back and we walk the cables and we said, oh wow, there's 5 more that are broken. And so I go back to my statement earlier, if we saw those 5 more cables were broken, then we're going to come in, we're going to shore the slab and we're going to repair it. And so the repair detailing is still the same whether it's that 1 cable or if it's the 5 cables. Does that make sense?
Yeah, okay. I guess so.
Okay.
And then I guess one final one. What are the chances that the roots are actually helping support so that they are actually holding back dirt that would otherwise be pushing harder against those walls?
So being as the walls were there first and the soil was there second, and before the trees actually got larger, the walls basically were holding up the full weight of the soil to begin with. And so in my opinion, the roots aren't really helping at that point, because the walls were already designed and are already withholding all that weight.
Okay, they were, but then there's been all these failures, which is this typical for a building to have all these kind of failures? It seems bad.
Okay, so yeah, it does. But the point you were just bringing up was in relationship to the actual walls itself. So the failures we're talking about is within the slab itself, not the walls themselves, but the slab and the PT that's in the slab. And so that's a different element than the actual walls themselves.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you. You are ready to move on? Yep. Now we move on to Tom Turley. Thank you.
Right. I also would like to thank the community for their great engagement on this project and for generating so many good ideas and alternatives to be considered. In fact, I heard a new idea from the public in the comments and was wondering if the engineers might be able to discuss it. The suggestion was made about more exploratory testing that maybe could be done quickly with directional boring and a camera to get to the anchor points of the PT cables to see what condition they're in underground in a kind of a non-disturbing test or non-disturbing exploration.
I'm going to start needing some slides at this point to help out. I apologize, but give me just a second, please. Can we possibly pull back up?
Would it be helpful to go back? Excuse me. Would it be helpful to go back to some of the original photos?
Yeah, if that would be great. Slide 11 in particular, I think would be most helpful. Okay. If you go back one slide, please. In particular, if you look at the top left or the top right detail, that really represents the edge of slab where the PT is anchored. And so what happens is after, there's two ends. There's a dead end and a live end. The dead end is actually cast into the concrete. The one on the left is where you actually put the jacking ram on. So what you do is you come in, you take the ram, which is the element that actually stretches the cable, the rubber band we talked about earlier, pulls on it with 30,000 pounds, and then they put these little clamps in there, and it clamps off. Once that's done, they take and pack it with grout. They put a grease cap on it, and then they pack it with grout. So if you were just to try and shove a scope or something down there to see it, all you would see is the grout. And so there's really no way to ascertain if you actually had water intrusion, unless, of course, like I spoke about earlier, if there was a failure and the cable actually popped and pushed that grout pocket out, then you can definitely see that that cable had failed. But there's no way to really ascertain how much degradation there is for the anchorages without taking out the grout.
All right. Thank you.
Oh, and Tom, I'd like to interject. Could Rebecca, could we go back to the one slide which shows which cables have failed? Oh. You just passed it. Yeah, you just passed it.
Right.
That
right
one.
There. Yep.
So the pink are the two lateral cables that are along parallel to El Camino, and then it looks like one that is inside the building. I'm going to call that north-south, but it's really,
Yeah, that's fine.
It's weird.
Let's all stick to the same terminology. Let's say north-south is up and down the page, east-west is left and right, just for ease of conversation.
So that cable, okay, and that's all the cables that have failed. Which was the one that you found recently that had?
Recently, up by the garage entrance, the cable that we quote-unquote are going north-south on the top of the page was discovered to have popped off the grout pocket.
Okay. All right.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
Right. And then I had a question for the arborist. I was curious about what the method of valuation of the trees, and could you describe that method and what it considered?
Yeah, sure, I'd be happy to. So the valuation that was used was consistent with industry standards, and it is actually specified in the existing heritage tree ordinance, and that's the trunk formula method identified in the guide for landscape appraisal in the most current edition of that appraisal guide.
And so I don't know how to go from diameter to dollars. What kinds of things does the formula do? Does it take into account the species of tree or the location or the community?
Yes, it does. There is a publication that is put out by the Western chapter of the International Society of Arboriculture, which provides a numerical value for species. Coast Redwood is obviously included in there as a common landscape tree. And for instance, Coast Redwood is native to the coastal region of California, so Menlo Park is just outside of its native range. So there's a valuation associated with that, Coast Redwood in our particular region.
Thank you.
All right, thank you, Tom. Now we'll go to Rebecca, and I don't have your last name, but Rebecca is one of our newest commissioners, and welcome.
Hi, I'd like to thank everyone for answering all of our questions and preparing the report.
I guess I have a question for the engineers. Just to be clear, on option 2, where you would retrofit with steel beams, is the only issue that the parking garage would have to be abandoned due to clearance issues? And could the rest of the building still be used safely, or is it a larger structural integrity issue with the whole building?
Okay. So for option 2, whereby we were talking earlier about coming back and basically supporting the existing slab with steel beams, there's a couple concerns with that. First and foremost, well, not first, but let me just walk through all the, to actually go back and install all those steel beams, the technique you'd go by is you have to, underneath the slab, for those of you who've walked, you've seen all the utilities. Like there's pipes, all electrical, all that good stuff. So to be able to put the beams right underneath the slab to support the slab, you'd basically have to take all those utilities out and then you put them all back in. But the other issue probably that wasn't conveyed clearly enough was if you were just to come back and put steel beams in to support the slab, that's more of a, I'm going to call it a medium to long-term fix because it supports the slab, but it doesn't take and stop the water degradation coming in. And so like I was talking about earlier, one of my concerns would be at the perimeter where the retaining walls are held up by the slab, we have these pieces of rebar that go from the slab to the wall, and that really what holds the top of the wall up. And so if there's no consideration given to that and we had further water damage, there's concerns with the wall not being able to be held up in place. The other thing is if there's further degradation of the slab, at some point, water's going to continue to get in, water's going to take and affect the steel that we're trying to put in place. And so it really just didn't seem, like a viable solution.
All right, thank you.
You're welcome.
And then this is just for the applicants in general, I guess. Is it correct that options 7 and 8 would cost the owner millions of dollars, including relocation of tenants and repair work? And can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, pardon me for just a minute. I have some notes on this. Yes, it's true. Options 7 and 8, the first flaw is that the work is considered sufficiently dangerous that the structural consultants, both of them as well as our contractor, determined that the building has to be evacuated for that work to occur. 2 months plus. I mean, the way we're looking at 2 months minimum to just do the exact work they're talking about, but all the prep work and everything else, you got to get everybody out of there. It's very dangerous work. That instantly breaches our tenant leases. I don't have a right to force them to exit and then require them to come back. A relocation, for example, for a company like Cornerstone Research with 2.5 floors of this building and several hundred people would cost them close to $1 million, probably $750,000. The logistics and the business interruption for them would be unbelievable. They would ask for a termination of their lease or they'd sue me for one, along with the millions of dollars they've invested in their improvements in the space, and they wouldn't come back. Same thing would happen to the other tenants that I have too. So that's one critical flaw. The loss of parking is another, and I know we've talked about not making this all about parking, but these tenants, when they're signing leases, that parking is not just for the people who work there. That's for all of their clients and their visitors, and those ebb and flow over time. There was a big changeover recently this month in the building where an entire wing got redone, and so that furniture is what's in the garage. Those people were temporarily put up in the San Francisco office while that work was done. Now they're all back, but they rely on that parking and they pay for it. So we had a situation where we had those two problems. We also have an issue that with option 7 and 8, to be real fair, contractors are afraid of doing this work. It's not industry standard, it's unorthodox, and it's hazardous. Our main general contractor, one of the largest ones in the area, Novo Construction, who would be running this whole project for us, told us they would back out if 7 and 8 were considered due to the liability risks and a danger to their personnel. So, you know, we've worked very hard to try and figure out how to accommodate any of these alternatives in a way, but different things happen on different alternatives that end up kind of knocking them out of the box. We have code issues that result from options 7 and 8. We lose a mandated critical emergency exit from the lower level. It would be filled with dirt. I don't know where it would go. And all of our utilities for the building come in off of El Camino, and we would lose access to them. So, you know, we did analyze it very carefully. Very daunting to lose your tenants. I probably then have no revenue, so I can't make ground lease payments, I can't make mortgage payments or property tax payments. I can't lose all my tenants. I shouldn't have to for that. Did that answer your question?
Yes, thank
Okay.
you.
Can I go follow up to that?
Oh, excuse me. Janelle has a question for you.
Sorry, may I ask you a few follow-ups to those questions? Sure. Okay, first of all, why isn't the building evacuated now?
The building isn't evacuated now primarily because we have 3 tendons that have failed that we know. And that isn't yet enough for us to view our problem as having an imminent collapse. But we're very, very concerned, and we're very ready to go on this. You know, it took this long to get here, doing all the steps, being sure we had the money, being sure we had the approval and the permit and everything we need. We were ready to go after October. So, yeah, I'm nervous every day, no question. But it doesn't serve any of us to just tell me to evacuate my building. I'll evacuate it if I have to, for sure. But right now I'm trying to focus on the problem and getting to the solution.
Okay, and then a follow-up question. Do you have any sort of insurance, and sorry, I don't know a whole lot about insurance, but for instance, if there's a structural problem that happens to a building requiring tenants to evacuate?
You know, I'd actually have to look into our insurance on that. I don't know specifically what my policy reads right now. I'm trying to fix the problem and be sure that I'm not being negligent in some way at this point. That's why I'm trying to fix the problem urgently.
Okay. And have there been any questionnaires out to the tenants of whether they, or to the extent to which they ever work from home or could telecommute or something like that if, God forbid, they should have to evacuate?
I haven't approached them about it yet. There's a lot of telecommuting going on all the time anyway, but there's a lot of synergy they get when they work together on their research projects, so they need to be there and together. A number of them are riding the train. A lot of them have to drive, and many of their clients arrive by car.
Yeah, okay. Okay, thank you very much. I have a separate question that's unrelated, so I don't know if you're...
Janelle, I think we should, if you didn't have a chance to answer your question, then I need to get, we'll have a discussion as well. And if you wanted to get a clarifying question, we do that.
I just have one more.
Who would you like to ask?
Oh, are we done with questions? Christian.
No, I haven't done my questions yet.
Oh, gosh.
oh, yeah.
Never mind. Sorry.
Thank you.
We skipped over Scott.
Thank you, Rebecca. Okay, I'm going to call back up Greg Wagner again because I have probably a lot of questions. Some have been answered, but I need some clarification. And Greg, thank you so much. Thank you so much for being informative, and you know, you seem to be the answer man for our questions. Starting out, I'm going to move this. Starting out, I believe James alluded to the fact that is there such a cable as a cable that has been waterproofed that could be used in repair? Like I've seen coated rebar for certain projects, like through salt. When you're in a ocean environment, you use that kind of material.
What you're really speaking about is the when we have highly corrosive environments and we're using rebar, you're talking about the epoxy-coated rebar. And so for something similar when it comes to PT, I'm not familiar with anything that is, higher, but I will say that the technology has changed. In particular for the anchorages themselves, there's better encapsulated systems at the anchors where you put the grease on and you put the cap over it. So the technology has changed. The PT and the sheathing itself, to my knowledge, hasn't changed drastically over time. But when it comes to actually repairing this PT slab, like we talked about earlier, the idea really is that if an anchor fails, we can slide the cable out because the cables should theoretically still have grease on it. To pull the cable out, it's not like you can just go up there with your hand and pull it out. They actually put the ram on it to pull it out.
Of course.
So they put it under load, and then they put they basically not to do a deep dive, but you basically grease up a new cable and you have to feed it back through. That's really the technique.
So in keeping in line with that discussion there, the conduit that the cable is in, does that fail over time as well? Is that probably what's happened? The conduit's failed and the water's gotten into the cable?
So there's a couple ways. When you take and walk a job site before concrete gets poured, one of the key things I always look for is to look at all the sheathing. The special inspector looks at all the sheathing, and if any of the sheathing is ripped or torn, it gets repaired. Sometimes what happens is, I spoke earlier about where cables are known to break, and so we talked about how the anchorages fail, but what I didn't really delve down into is I spoke earlier about how the cables basically drape up and down as you go across the slab. And so sometimes what happens is when you get water in the end of the cable, it wicks. And so what it does is it travels inside the cable and then goes down to the low point, and it just sits there and ponds. Of course. And so when it sits there and ponds, it basically can degrade the cable, and that's where you basically get a fail. And that's why anytime we do have a cable fail, when we pull it out, the first thing we do is measure it, go back into the building to see where it failed, and sometimes we'll chip out the bottom of the slab. We've had situations for this ponding situation I just spoke of where you come back and you chip out the slab, and sometimes water comes out. And so that's how you know what's happened.
So, and that, you answered one of my questions earlier, but following up with that is, there are two cables that are parallel to El Camino that have failed. If you were to pull those cables out, which are accessible from both sides of the Ravenswood side or from the parking lot side, you would be able to determine where the failure was on those cables.
Yeah, basically we would take it out from I'm going to say the...
Yeah, I can see it too, yeah.
Okay, great. My left, we take it out from that side, and you can basically measure it, and you can work back into the building and find out where it actually failed.
So that would indicate most likely where the leak was then?
The tough part about that question is it could be twofold. One is it could have been a tear in the cable that we spoke about earlier. It could be water coming back in. The water coming back in, like I spoke about earlier, the cable starts at mid-depth at the edge, and then it typically goes up.
Excuse me, Rebecca, could you get up that slide that he had earlier with the cross-section?
Yeah, the cross-section would be great, Rebecca. Thank you.
It's real near the one I think actually we're going for one more. It's the one that had the cable ends and the...
Yep, that one right there. So, I guess first and foremost, this is great. I get to talk about structural engineering, so this is good for me.
That's why we need to be educated. Thank you very much.
I actually enjoy structural engineering still. So basically what I was speaking about is the cable starts up high at the column, and then it goes low in between the columns, and then it goes high at the column, and it does that across the entire building.
Right.
And so what we've typically seen, if water's getting in at the edge of the slab and it's going to come in and pond, it usually doesn't get past that first low spot, okay?
Right.
Because it doesn't make sense. Water's not going to go back up. Water goes to the lowest spot.
Absolutely.
And so, in essence, if the cables we were just speaking of, if they're like 2 or 3 bays in, away from the edge, and it breaks, then based on experience, we would say, okay, why did it break over here? And so it's either a tear in the cable, or potentially you get some water intrusion from the top. So you have to kind of, unfortunately, sometimes you have to just chip out the slab locally just to take a look and see what has happened.
Well, now how many dips would you say are in that length of cable that's parallel? I mean, if there's 8 or 10, 20, 15 dips, right?
No, the building is only 150 feet that way, so there's, say the columns are at 30 feet on center. And so, in that direction, that's about two something. And so the cables that are broke, it's 1 or 2 dips in. Let's just call it that way, if you don't mind.
Okay, so focusing even more. You pull out the cable, you find the break, you can localize where the water came in within reason. Not a pinpoint, but between those 2 columns or something else like that. What I'm trying to get at is, if you were to pull those 2 cables, which have to be pulled for repairs, you're going to know where the water, you're going to know approximately where the water was getting in that caused the degradation of those cables.
Possibly. The tough part about this is, I have to be careful on what I say at
No,
the
no,
it's so, because there's a lot of hypothesis in this. And so
Yes.
let's say one possible situation is if the cable broke at mid-span, which is at the low point.
Yes.
So anytime water could get in at one of the high points, let's say there was some degradation on the top of the slab for some odd reason, and water got in at that high point, it could possibly drape back down, like we talked about earlier, and get to that low point a few bays in.
Right. But I should move on. But once again, there's several dips, and you're going to be able to find over 150 feet. You could focus within 40 feet of where the break occurred. Where we know where the break is, but where the water got in. I bring this up because when I toured the building, the basement of the building, I noticed that the efflorescence going through the concrete blocks was mostly towards Jeffries, and that would be where there are the 4 trees. But the water damage that I noticed, I'm not an expert, but I saw drainage of streaks of rust. Those were getting in around the collars of the sprinkler pipe and some of the electrical conduit. So to me, from what I saw on the side wall, the breaks for those cables that are lateral with El Camino might be down at the Jeffries end of the slab. That's my obviously non-engineering observation. And where I'm going with this whole thing is if you pull cables out and you find, you have to pull the cables out from the ends. Now the 2 cables that run the length of the building with parallel to El Camino, they are accessible right now, I guess. I mean, maybe moving something, but you obviously you need to be able to get to those 2 ends. The one cable that runs parallel to the ramp as it goes down, obviously one end is towards the train tracks, the other end is toward the one of the redwood trees. I actually don't know exactly where that is in line. I'm trying to see if there's a way to determine where the leaks are coming by the cables before any you could conceivably repair a cable and then repair the waterproofing, because that would ultimately give you the answer you're looking for. You pull out the cable, oh my gosh, but you have to repair the waterproofing in that area. That's what I'm looking for.
Okay. Can we go back, please, to the plan detail that shows the actual cables that are broke? Perfect. Oh,
yep.
Perfect. Okay. So we're going to go another layer deeper. Just for a second, please, so please humor me.
I'm learning.
I apologize. It's hard to teach PT in a session like this, but I'm going to do my best.
You're doing great. Believe me, this is great.
The pink one that runs up and down the page.
Yes.
Okay. So there's we talked earlier about there's an end that you pull from, and then there's another end that's kind of like the buried end. When we get cables that are really long, like upwards of over 120 feet, we basically have to pull them from both ends. And so,
you'll have to explain that. You can't just feed a rope or a wire through a piece of conduit.
So I'm talking more about pulling. And so if you said, how would I go about repairing that one pink one that runs up and down the page?
Yes.
So yes, we could take, and let's just, for the sake of conversation, let's just say the anchors failed and we had to replace the cable. Doesn't matter on which end. So we're going to take that cable out and we're going to repair it. And we're going to repair the anchorage. So if to take the cable out, let's say the one by the tree failed and it popped on the north side, because that's what I think happened, because it popped. And so let's say we go on the north side, we pull the cable out, and we're going to feed a new cable in. We would have to feed that cable down all the way, and then we'd have to feed it through the very bottom portion of the slab, the page south, to be able to seat a new anchor. So we'd have to have access to that.
I do understand that. You have to have access to both sides.
Okay.
But once again, I think the cables that run with El Camino would give you a very good indication where the water leak was. I don't know where the cable that in the screen up there is vertical, the one that's parallel to the ramp going down. I don't know where that access is, if it's right in line with the tree or not. Where I'm getting at with this is it seems that there could be water leakage from areas that may not be directly related to the trees, which is possible. The other question obviously has to do with this, but how is the waterproofing applied? I read your report, or actually maybe it's a contractor's report of the preparation for the concrete, but is this a rolled sheet material? Is this a painted on material? Is this a sprayed or how is it applied, and when?
I'm going to have the waterproofer talk about this one.
Excellent. Thank you.
You're welcome.
So there are many waterproofing options that are available.
I just, if you have decided on one, I only need to know about the one that you might use.
The one we had decided on is
Yes.
both a fluid applied and a rolled good. So it's basically a coating that goes on first, and then we're embedding a peel and stick type of a self-adhesive membrane over it.
So this material you roll on, it must have joints, I assume. I mean, you're not going to get a piece of material that's 150 feet long and 40 feet wide, I imagine. You're going to have joints.
The coating is more or less monolithic, but the rolled-on material does have joints. It's about 3 feet wide and roughly 100 feet long.
So
or 30 feet long.
How easy is it to pour some waterproofing material or apply some waterproofing material and then at a future date apply more waterproofing material to that joint, yeah?
That's a good question. I think if you assume that the waterproofing membrane is intact and all you're doing is you're cutting out a piece and you're patching a piece, you can patch into it. But let's say the waterproofing material is completely failed, like we have here. And you're trying to waterproof a small section or a length of it. How do you tie it in to a section that's completely failed? So the problem is the tie-in. You can't get a proper tie-in, then both you're compromising the brand new product you put in, and you're also creating more of an avenue for water to get in because you've removed a piece of the old waterproofing.
So one more question about the waterproofing would be, there currently is a walkway that divides those two sections of trees and lawn, and I would assume that the waterproofing is probably in its best shape underneath that material of the mortar and the concrete that creates that walkway.
Yes, we've examined the waterproofing in various areas, and the waterproofing has failed everywhere, not just where the trees are. It's just old. It's more than 30 years old, and it's beyond its serviceable life.
So between you and the engineer from the engineering company, it seems that even if you remove the cables, determine where the leak, the water intrusion was going on, and if you were to do part of the work in half of the, on the podium, you would not be confident that the waterproofing that you applied that's new would not bond well with the old, even if you were to do the older section at a later time.
That is correct. That's the weakest area, and that's where we find the waterproofing, the fails, is at the tie-in between the old and the new.
Okay. And one more question. I think in one of the diagrams there seem to be cables in this diagram in the upper right corner that showed signs of rust. You're fine, Rebecca, or whatever. It seemed like on one of the engineering diagrams, we know that there was some water intrusion near the wall that faces El Camino, but I thought in the upper right corner or in the corner that was on the Jeffrey side, but back toward, I can only point to it. On that upper corner, was there some notable rust on the ends of the cables as well? Like that blue one or something like that? It seemed like that there was some water intrusion in that upper corner of the building, the garage of the building.
So because that entire section, there's a part on the right-hand side that has a different kind of waterproofing where you're parking on the surface of the slab. The surface of the slab can be waterproofed because there's no trees, there's no landscaping, there isn't anything. I am not sure what the condition of the cables are on that side and on that surface, and that's something our structural engineer can perhaps address.
If it's, yeah, like where is that photo on the right? Where is that? Because it's exposed. It's in the back, right? And that's the cable that has snapped, the end of the cable.
Yes, I believe this photo is not of this project. It is of the project. Yeah, it's in the back. It's in the back, okay. Yeah, it's a structural question, so I'll...
Yeah. I guess, yeah, I would think so, but...
I actually don't remember where this photo was taken, but it's readily apparent when you see this photo that this is occurring above the soil.
Yes.
You can also tell that this one was not grouted back. But I think this might be over on by the trees that aren't being removed, because all that soil is down lower than the slab.
Oh, you have Ken there to answer that question.
Yeah,
Thank you.
I actually, this is Ken.
Yes, I can.
Yeah. So I actually reviewed that photo because I put that in the slide deck, and it's part of the KPFF report that was done in 2017 that was submitted as part of our planning documents.
Yes.
And that's actually one of many. That's the cable up in the north side.
The train track side.
Correct.
And
those,
is that? It's not grouted, but has that popped out or anything, or is that it's just not grouted? I mean, that's typical, but it needs grout, or is that showing failure? I mean, you're not there, but I don't know.
Yeah, like I said, I don't exactly remember this one, but this is an indication of a cable that kind of it's either it could have popped, or this could have just been a sloppy cut job, because like I talked about earlier, you basically put the ram on, you stress the cable, you seat it, and then you cut the cables off. And you usually cut them off at the edge of slab such that you can put grout back over it. And so, I can't say with any 100% certainty what's going on with this one just yet.
Okay. All right. Thank you. I'm done with my questions. I think we're done with our question session. Now the commission will discuss among. Oh, thank you very much. Oh, I'm sorry. We have one more question, clarifying question. Okay, please. Yeah, go right ahead.
Okay, so this is a question for Christian. So we have all these other redwood trees around there in the area as well, and there's just been a lease entered into that's going to be 50 more years with this presumably same building. So I'm kind of wondering, what are the chances that this problem is going to recur with others of the trees as they grow bigger? They're going to get 50 more years of growing time, and so are they going to, what's the risk that they will bump up into this same problem? It sounds like, if I'm understanding right, the waterproofing lasts about 30 years and then it fails, so you have to go back in and do that. And the trees, the lease is 50 more years. And anyway, I'm not good at math, but do you understand what I'm saying well enough to consider it?
I think I understand the question, and it sounds to me like it's really an engineering question in that the waterproofing failed independently of the root intrusion. And therefore, I don't really have a comment in terms of what the impact on the tree roots would be on the waterproofing, because I'm not familiar enough with the waterproofing to know what the expected lifespan is of that.
That is interesting to know, but my actual question is more the remaining trees. Let's say these 7 were taken out. There are a bunch of other redwood trees that were planted there at the same time. The lease is for about 50 more years. So those trees are going to get 50 more years, assuming they're not also taken out, for their roots to expand. I know some of them are further from the building. Some seem like they're not all that much further from the building. So I just wonder, what's your forecast of what is going to happen to those tree roots? Will they start bumping up against the building such that the next time anything has to be checked out down under the building, we're going to be here again?
Yes, in all likelihood, the roots will continue to expand. It's not unusual for roots to extend well beyond the edge of the canopy of the tree above ground. I think what's important to consider here is the proximity of those trees to the building and the podium slab. And what is unique about these 7 in particular is their close proximity to the waterproofing work that needs to be done.
Thank you.
Deb, go ahead.
Okay, sorry, I guess I had my mic on the whole time last time, so I didn't mean to. Yeah, so I want to get back to the structural stuff. To me, this is the heart of the matter. I mean, I really struggle with this. I can sympathize with you because having this structural issue is scary, okay? And it needs to be addressed. So I will just start by saying that I fully kind of support that. But having said that, I'm going to ask a series of questions about how we can maybe accomplish that. So first of all, I asked earlier about how you could access those so that you can survey them all. And correct me if I'm wrong, but my interpretation of this is that that you would have to trench down probably maybe 2 feet, maybe to access these so that you could, and there's roots there for sure, so you'd have to, let's just say a scenario where you just cut a whole trench 2 feet deep, or whatever it may be, to get to these joints, evaluate them all, Because, I mean, I would, if I were you, I would want to first know what's the level of damage there, because I don't really know. Like, I mean, obviously they're not all failing, but it's just, that seems to be the key issue to me. The primary key issue right now is first and foremost structural integrity, and then the waterproofing is something I'm going to address, because I know they're hand in hand, but I think the first absolute critical issue is getting to those things and looking at them and getting them repaired. Is that a fair assessment? Could that be done?
From the structural side, without a doubt, I concur. That first and foremost is my concern as well, is to be able to get in there, to be able to review and see what kind of degradation we have.
Okay. So with that thinking then, second part is, can you explain to me where you think the majority of this water intrusion is coming from? Is it, I understand that the waterproofing has failed. I get that. So is it mostly because of irrigation of the surrounding landscape that's sort of seeping in and getting down the walls? Because I see where the membrane was maybe not properly attached to the wall, so it's creating a void, is what I've read somewhere in the report. So is that your assessment? Is it primarily irrigation water, or is there something else? Is it groundwater? Or is it, what is
I'm
it?
going to ask someone else to answer this question, if you don't mind.
So yes, the landscaping is probably the biggest component, because there's sprinklers that come on regularly and they're just watering the lawn area. But if the landscaping and the water was turned off, then primarily in the wintertime, you would get rains, and then you'd get rainwater in the wintertime.
So in your opinion then, is it mostly mostly a surface water issue getting down in there?
Yeah, so if you look at the diagram, you've got water on the surface of the horizontal surface, and then you also have water coming down the wall on the vertical surface.
Okay.
So if there were no trees, there was no watering going on, then the vertical surface and the horizontal surfaces may be relatively dry for 8 or 9 months out of the year when it's not raining.
Great. So with that thinking, because obviously we're not going to be able to repair the existing water damage. It's there. It's, you know, the key is, like, let's not let it get worse. So first structural, second, you know, addressing the waterproofing, making sure the concrete isn't, you know, getting wet. I would also, just as a side note, want to know that you investigate other potential leaks, because I did see rusting pipes throughout the garage, and which made me wonder if there's other sources of water getting in. So so I would just encourage you to do a full evaluation, if you haven't already, of the piping, because I suspect there might be some water getting in more in the center of the garage. And there's probably one spot in particular, you know, it's under a parking spot, heavily water damaged, like water dripping out of a rusted pipe. So, but I'm just going with this thinking then. So the next part of my question is, with this work, what is the most detrimental issue to the tree? Is it the structural repairs, or is it the need to do the waterproofing?
So once again, this diagram kind of shows you both. In order to do the full waterproofing, you would have to excavate what's on the left-hand side of the diagram, in which case you're going all the way down the wall, and you're going all the way on the horizontal surface. If you were doing the minimum amount of waterproofing, which is the question you asked, you would have to do what's on the right-hand side diagram, and in which case you would simply go down 2 or 3 feet below the surface of the slab. And you'd have to remove everything on the horizontal surface on the podium. So that's the minimum amount that would be done. And what the evaluation that was done by the arborist on both sides agree that even the minimum amount of waterproofing on the right-hand side would not be able to save the trees.
Yeah, so, okay, so I'm going with I just, bear with me, because I'm almost done, I promise. Okay, so my next question is just with the waterproofing. If we had a scenario, you mentioned with, like, for instance, with the, let's just take the parking, that side parking ramp, that could be, it's a concrete surface, that could be water, that surface there is techniques to waterproof the surface.
Yes.
Okay, so is there a potential scenario where you could have almost like I'm envisioning a Cafe Baroni type situation, where just get rid of all this upper landscaping, instead of digging roots and cleaning off the concrete and making sure it's completely dry and then waterproofing and cutting trees down, like, is there not a more economic approach of maybe saying, why don't we approach this from the top layer by putting, and it'd have to be thought through, because you don't want roots coming up and bubbling your hardscape, but could you not create almost like a hardscaped area that's first waterproofed and then putting the hardscape on top, like whether it be whatever, I saw some of the patio materials that you were looking at. So I'm basically asking the question, could you hardscape that whole area up to the point where the trees are, and then fold down like you have here, the waterproofing that's up on that upper corner, because you're going to need to make sure that the water isn't running down the side of the wall. And then if that is true and you could do that, then by my assessment, I've also looked at this report from Doug Dobach, who has suggested an alternative where instead of doing a 4-foot by 4-foot trench for this work, you could do a 2.5 by 4-foot trench, and he provided a nice table that showed what that looks like. And by my assessment, even though, yes, it's not within the 3x, the diameter, there are a number of trees that are close. I mean, there's one that's within 86%. So what I'm getting at is I feel like of all these trees, rather than just going all or nothing, I'm just looking at a risk management approach and asking the question, could some of these trees be saved? Because by my assessment, it looks like if you had a different approach, you could, A, save a lot of money from not cutting the trees down, digging all those roots out, applying, it just seems, I'm naive here, but it seems like that would be much simpler, and that you could at least keep some of these trees. So that's sort of my proposal, and I would like to just discuss if that's a possibility.
So I believe the team did look into the fact that, like on the diagram on the right, if the trench is, let's say, not 4 feet, if it's 2.5 feet or 3 feet, like you're suggesting, you would still impact the majority of the trees, and you would still be into the primary root zone, which would not be able to save the trees. Now, I'm not an arborist, and that's a question for the arborists. If 1 out of the 7 tree could potentially be saved, but if you cut down some of those roots, you would still have to anchor the tree in some manner.
Actually, yeah. So I guess my question, first of all, for you, just plain and simply, is it possible to do what I just said? Is it possible to think about doing a different approach up top to create less water going down? First, addressing structural, absolutely, but then looking at a different approach to preventing water down below. Is that a possibility?
So can I make a little correction? Sorry, I'm just going to interrupt for a quick second. So I know you're reading the peer review report from the structural engineer, but it needed to be combined also with the arborist, and so the Jim Clark from Hort Science did the analysis in a table that did the because we did look at that, the reduced, and it was still within.
No, I know that. I know it's within. I see it here. It says, yes, within, but I'm looking a little deeper and saying, well, some of them are close. Some of them are within 86%. So what my question is, I also read somewhere where, and I wish I wrote it somewhere, where it said that a healthy coastal tree, coastal redwood, has been, somewhere here, if I can find it, can withstand some root disruption and it says, okay, healthy trees are more tolerant of root loss, and I'm just quoting from the report, okay, so I'm not, it says the current health condition of the trees are good. Healthy trees are more tolerant of root loss, and the coastal redwoods are considered to be tolerant of site disturbances and root loss. So with that statement, what I'm simply suggesting is not all of them can be saved, but I think with that premise, I'm asking if a different solution could be explored where, yes, you would still have to get in with that 3 feet, but you would be not at the 100%. And then you could save some of those trees. So that's what I'm asking if that's feasible. And then with the second caveat that you would then put those trees on a monitoring program. So you would then be able to at least assess, hey, are they doing okay? Are their roots growing back? And if not, then we can look at if they need to be removed.
Deb, I'm gonna make a suggestion here. It sounds like you're coming up with an alternative. I think what we want to do tonight is we want to first review over what options have been put in front of us by the appellant and see if any of those would work. And if they don't work, then if you have another option, we could suggest that. But for right now, I think we should have our discussion. And what is at hand is that we are seeing if we are going to support the city staff's recommendation to remove the trees or to vote against that. But I don't think we should expand onto different options.
Yeah,
until-
I'm sorry, I simply wanted some clarifying technical questions on whether that thinking was even rational. So that's why I asked the
So
questions.
Deb, if I could just respond to that very briefly, and Scott, it is one of the alternatives that was evaluated. I believe it was a last-minute alternative, but in reference to the comment that was made regarding redwood tree roots tolerance, or redwood trees tolerance of root disturbance, that is specifically in reference to the health of the trees. They're a very vigorous growing tree, as I'm sure we all know, one of the largest growing trees in the world, and therefore they can respond pretty aggressively to root loss. So that's specifically in reference to the tree's health. What was evaluated by the peer review arborist is the impact on the trenching, the reduced trenching size on the tree's stability. And the evaluation was that it's still within 3 times the diameter of the trunk of the tree, and it would compromise the tree stability.
Okay. So just to so if it was at 99% of it, if it was just off by an inch, I'm just trying to kind of get a sense of, it's not all or nothing. There's got to be some degree of risk in there that is lessened. So that's why I'm just, maybe this is not the time for an alternate discussion, but that's why I'm asking the question, because it hasn't been posed that way, and I haven't seen somebody give that analysis, so I'm just asking the question, but it doesn't seem like it's an all or nothing based on the 3x only, and that's it. So, I just would like to know if there is some risk ranking or something. I think I also saw that somebody could measure load on the trees and things and do various things to kind of assess that, so. But I don't want to dominate the conversation, so.
All right. Well, so here we are. I'm going to read over what we are asked to do tonight. It's coming right out of the agenda. It says, issue a determination on appeal of staff's approval of a heritage tree permit for removal of 7 redwood trees at 1000 El Camino Real. So what I think we should now do is we have heard from the owner, and we have heard from the appellants, and the appellants has given us different options, and I think that in the context of those options that are in front of us, if we want to discuss among us, if any of those seem viable, that's fine. If not, then maybe making other suggestions would be something we could discuss. But I think we should look at what's been presented to us and make some decisions on those. So I would say, Deb, you were talking about, is there anything besides an option that you feel is a viable alternative to what we've seen from the appellant?
Yeah, I guess for me, the options that have been presented in, I guess a 1.5 to 2 month time frame to which this has been iterating, based on those, I don't see a lot of great options. But I also, having said that, I feel like I don't feel like the question's been asked. What would we need to do to look at this solution from can the trees be kept? Because I have a lot of unanswered questions based on just some of the thinking I just gave you. So based on what I see, I think it is the building definitely needs to be repaired. That's my opinion. It needs to be structurally sound, and it needs to be a functioning building. But I really struggle with the notion of that is also, nobody can deny that that's a centerpiece of our city. So it's really not a very pleasant discussion or thought for anybody. So I don't really have an answer right now. That's just my initial thinking. My initial thinking would be we need to explore more options, but I'm sure that's not what a lot of people want to hear. But
okay, and I'm sorry, I should add that are any of the requirements, requirement 1, requirement 2, requirement 1, the condition of the tree or trees with respect to disease, danger of falling, proximity to existing or proposed structures, and interference with utilities. Requirement 2, the necessity to remove the tree or trees in order to construct proposed improvements on the property. And then not an option, but requirement 8, the availability of reasonable and feasible alternatives that would allow for the preservation of the trees. So why we are thinking about, why we're having our discussion, have some of these requirements been met, or do we feel they have not been met? And then that would be something we would make a decision on. Okay, I'm going to let Janelle speak. Thank you.
So we're having a discussion about alternatives and their feasibility. Is that right?
Well, the appellant has presented some alternatives.
Right.
And we need to decide if, of these 3 criteria that were mentioned for support of removal of the trees, have any of the appellant's recommendations, do we feel those will clarify all of these and none of those requirements will be met?
Yeah.
We have to make a decision based on what the Heritage Tree Ordinance says and does the permit applicant meet these requirements to get those trees removed. That's our job tonight.
So I am interested in alternative 1, and I feel like it could be feasible and reasonable. I feel like I need to know more information about how feasible and reasonable it is, but it seems like something that could work.
Okay, we're just going to go down the line. James?
Sorry, and can you just, alternative 1, which is the parking garage, or?
Think of the appellant.
Okay, that's what I thought.
And to clarify, building a new parking garage was alternate 1, option 1?
I'm not even, well, it's abandon the underground and just shore that up.
Okay,
that
you
one?
do see an option is viable. Okay.
Yeah, abandoned parking garage, I mean, build new parking structure, I'm not even sure that there's that parking off to the side that's already above ground. So
okay.
Great. Unclear what build new parking structure, to what extent that is required.
Thank you. James, there you go.
All right, just to concur with what Janelle said, options 1 and potentially 2 in terms of as much as those result in a loss of the parking garage, I thought the final public speaker raised a pretty interesting point when he said if you thought about this from the perspective of the trees were there and whether or not you were going to build a parking garage underneath them, we probably wouldn't allow the trees to be removed for that purpose. And the structural integrity of the building seems like it could still be dealt with options 1 or 2 by abandoning the underground parking garage. And at the very least, that the alternative parking options haven't been fully explored in terms of, like you said, surveying the tenants, exploring other options. Is another parking garage necessary? How much parking is really needed? So I am interested in 1 and 2. I'm just going through the rest of these. 3, 4, and 5 don't seem especially feasible to me. 6, until you had your last line of questioning, Deb, I was, I think, a little confused about this one. I thought the trenching would have resulted in the death of the trees, not just a compromise to their stability. And the peer structural reviewer did seem to think that bracing was possible, so 6 is potential. And then 7 and 8, they are very recent community submitted suggestions, so maybe they're overly complicated, they have too many drawbacks, but I think if they were feasible with, abandoning those parking spaces, but again, 1 or 2 seem like the most attractive options to me right now.
I think it's a challenge to be asked to reflect on the value of parking being above that of the trees in our community, and I think that is one of the fundamental dynamics you've heard tonight. I share that sentiment. I think that it's hard to think you're choosing a parking structure over that, but I do think it's important to remember what I understand to be the case, which is for options 1 and 2, I believe the waterproofing would still need to occur, and without disrupting the environment of the tree, you wouldn't be able to do the waterproofing, which would be needed to stabilize the slab, regardless of if you used the parking garage. And I think for me, that's what makes those not viable. As much as I would hesitate to choose or would never choose parking over the trees, I would choose safety over them. And I think for me, that's my fundamental concern, is it sounds like there's a lot of unknowns of the safety of the structure and also the safety of the trees if they were to stay in place and we were to move forward with the waterproofing. Would they be able to withstand like the windstorm we just had, for example, or would that result in a safety hazard? I think that's a concern for me.
Thank you, Ryan. Tom?
Yes, so as I look at it, I definitely agree with what Commissioner Price has just mentioned about safety being an important issue, and I do see the need for the periodic maintenance of the waterproofing of the structure to keep the structure safe. So, and then we've got this conflict of what has been mentioned both by the applicant and members of the public about a possible mistake of putting these trees too close to this structure, and that the two are just too close together, and that it may have been a mistake. And in reviewing this, I look forward in the future and think, yeah, we shouldn't have this happen. We shouldn't put a tree that that can grow to 300 feet so close to a building. We should be careful where we put those trees. And another member of the public also helped frame it for me and making me look forward to, we shouldn't make people fear their planting of trees. They should expect reasonable treatment by government of their ability to balance the issues and manage their property. I also want to look at what is being characterized as the removal of 7 trees, and then it always stops for me right there. And it's not just the removal of 7 trees, it's the replacement of 7 trees with 14 trees that are presumably not a mistake, that those trees will be selected for their ability to be managed and cared for and moved, or whatever needs to happen 3 or 4 decades from now when waterproofing is needed again. Just assuming these waterproofing systems need to be maintained, and the building needs to be managed for that. I also heard a lot of great concern, and I definitely agree with it by the public, concern about climate change and wanting to manage our carbon footprint. And I look at the carbon footprint of rebuilding a building or building a parking garage is huge. And I look at the carbon footprint of turning trees into either mulch or lumber. I don't know what the destiny is for those trees, but then the 14 new trees are given their start and they do their action and provide their value. So I'm looking at this not as an all or nothing, but as a chance to honor the Heritage Tree Ordinance purpose, which is to have government help make balanced decisions about what goes on with trees and that they're not recklessly lost. And I see that the property has 76 trees now, and I understand the plan is it would have 7 more than that after. They wouldn't be the same individual trees, but hopefully they would undo mistakes that were made. So I'm looking at the different situations and trying to get a frame of reference for, what are the different alternatives, and do they allow the continued use of the building, and do they produce amenities that we all value from trees?
Thank you, Tom. Rebecca, please.
Yeah, I would like to second what Tom and Ryan have just said. I think when I asked the question about 1 and 2, it seemed that it would be unsafe in the long term and that there would still be a lot of water damage to the building. So I'm just not convinced that those are great options, although at first to me they seemed like they might be the most feasible. I just feel like they're going to require a lot more repair work down the line, and we're going to be here doing the same thing again. And yeah, I'd like to second that I'm concerned that people will feel discouraged to plant trees on their properties if we sort of penalize the current owner here for planting these redwood trees in the first place only 40 years ago, and not really understanding that the root systems would be, not really, that they wouldn't really work so close next to a big office building. I guess I view it differently than if these redwood trees had been here before we all started living in Menlo Park. It seems like the current owner planted them, and now we're realizing that they don't really work in this space and they require a lot of water usage, which has its own, impact on our environment. So as much as I am also really uncomfortable with removing these beautiful trees, I feel like we've gone so in depth with all of these alternatives, and I'm not sure that any of the current ones are really feasible.
Thank you very much, Rebecca. I mean, they're beautiful trees. They are fantastic trees. They were planted when the structure was built. From the photos, and it was great to see those photos, it was clear that they hadn't been there for 200 years or 2,000 years. I can say that being on this commission, I have learned a lot about trees and location and proximity and species, where to plant trees and where you shouldn't plant trees. And I think that since 1980, we have all learned, at least those of us in the field of planting trees or building buildings, have learned that there are some trees that shouldn't be planted in certain locations. I also feel that there is this building owner, and we look at him as, man, he has a lot of tenants, he has a lot of money, he should do the repairs. I tried to put my feet in his shoes, and it doesn't really, if you have to do a repair to keep the building in good shape, to keep it safe, then that is a cost he's going to incur. But to change, in some of these options, to change the design of the building that could increase his cost by 7 or 8 times, that is not something I would want to face. Once again, and I've done this for a little bit, I tend to draw the line on trees based on what came first type of thing. I'm not a huge fan of trees that are planted on top of any structure. I mean, like Facebook out there has trees that are going to cause waterproofing problems, and they're going to be pulled out. I mean, I may not be around, but that's going to happen. So that's a bad design idea in my opinion, though I like their little forest there. But it seems like what we have here is some trees that are causing damage. We already know that. To fix the problem, it looks like the trees would have to be removed. I know that some of those trees are a few feet away, but it seems like you cut 40% of the roots, and I'm not too confident that I want to be walking down the sidewalk at that point in a windstorm, knowing that a lot of the support came from the roots that went over the parking structure. So I definitely have read all the options, and I really appreciate what the appellants had come up with some creative ideas. I don't believe that any of them answer the problem of taking care of the waterproofing issue. And I do feel that citing, number one, I agree that condition of trees, they're healthy now. I don't think we can consider that they would be unhealthy from doing the work. I think we have to look at them as they are right now. But 2 and 8, the necessity to remove the trees in order to construct proposed improvements in the property would be met, and the availability of reasonable and feasible alternatives that would allow the preservation of the trees does not seem to be in front of us tonight. If there was something else that came up or some other idea that would do that, wow, that would be great. But as of the information in front of us, I'm a huge tree fan, but I think these trees are the wrong trees for the location. And I would ask that maybe there could be I've seen the landscape plans, but maybe we could get some evergreen trees in that planting. That way that in the wintertime, and I don't know one of the species that might be evergreen, but I think the idea of the trees is it provides a visual buffer from the street to the building, and the birch and the London plane, they lose their leaves in the autumn, and so is it possible to maybe have some evergreens there? That's a recommendation, I guess, not really a question, but a recommendation. Yeah, thank you.
The Brisbane are evergreen. It's only the birch that are not. Okay,
thank you very much. So that's where I'm at. I think we have all of us here on the commission. I thought we've voiced our ideas, but we can have a discussion if you want to ask any questions, Deb or James. Go right ahead.
Sure. I just want to clarify again. So with option 2, I heard some discussion of how waterproofing would still be needed even if steel beams were run across there, but I didn't hear that for option 1, for simply filling the underground garage. At that point, the slab would simply be resting on new soil. It would be packed up, presumably, throughout the entirety of the garage. So it seems like, it seems like there hasn't been a mention of the cost at least being onerous. Really the only drawback it seems like we heard about with that was parking and then rerunning utilities, but utilities wasn't discussed at great extent. Again, I just feel the parking has been explored sufficiently, and maybe I'm wrong and the waterproofing would still need to be examined, in which case the roots would need to be cut, but if it's simply filled, so the slab is now resting on ground, no roots are cut, doesn't compromise the stability of the trees. It doesn't seem like a safety hazard caused by the trees, and then it seems like the safety issues with the building are subsequently addressed.
So just to be clear on option number 1 and 2, and I understand you're talking about potentially reducing parking and other issues, but the reason why it certainly just cannot be done legally is because the SFPUC line, if they put a parking garage or structure somewhere else, which would be needed in this case to meet the parking requirements and to eliminate all of the parking, would likely require that. There would need to be some kind of structure, and that's why that option, again, is just legally not doable from the city's standpoint. And then with the second one, with the retrofitting of the steel beams, you're reducing the vehicle clearance. And I know you understand that part of it, but it would be a code violation that we just couldn't take on as a city to do that.
Thank you, Rebecca. Just legally speaking, I wonder if there are waiver possibilities or other ways to get around. So let's assume that for a minute that everyone agreed that we should do number 1. And we were abandoning the parking, the underground parking. So there's still that parking off above ground to the side, correct?
Right, but it's not owned by the building owners.
So they'd have to negotiate for another way.
And we've received a letter from the adjacent neighbor that they were not willing to explore that.
I understand. Okay, and then just in terms of the city's legal requirements for the amount of parking, are those subject to waiver, or are they never, ever changed?
So the parking requirement for this site is regulated by the plan development permit for the site. And the only way to reduce the parking would be to do a plan development amendment, but the property owner would have to first agree to go through that application process. And then that would also require planning commission and city council review. And we'd also have to do additional parking studies to see, if they were to eliminate all the parking, could they support their tenants with only the 29 remaining spaces? They'd have to find some way to accommodate the other spaces.
Thank you.
I just want to ask one follow-up question, because I think the question James asked and Janelle was mentioning is still unclear. With option 1, what is the consequence to the waterproofing, or is that still relevant for option 1? So do we still need waterproofing for the structure to be sound in the case of choosing option 1?
Okay, so when we say get rid of the parking, what are you thinking? Fill it all with concrete? Is that what you're thinking? Okay, well, we can't do it with soil because we won't be able to reach the compaction. So we have to fill it all with concrete, and then that would be not environmentally friendly.
I don't know where I saw it, but that's not what I read. I read about another option, and I just was struggling to go through here and find where the heck it was in these 300 pages, and I couldn't find it. But it was not a concrete solution, it was a concrete solution, but it wasn't that.
Okay, I would let the structural engineer talk about it, because that's not an easy thing to do, really, to just fill it in and let it like a slurry material and let it harden. It's not an easy thing to do. I'll let the structural engineer go on that.
Greg, could you come up again, please? Thank you so much. And Janelle, your actually, Banna, your question to Greg is?
Okay.
So the question is that they going to fill that parking lot totally with soil or some kind of a concrete, some material to make it a solid, so that can provide a support for the podium level above, and then not to worry about collapsing the podium level.
And let's just make sure we're talking about just below the podium level, not filling the garage, just filling the area of the garage that is, I mean, it's just 30-foot wide by 150 feet, not the whole garage.
So yeah,
the podium.
It would fill in the whole garage. So I think the
garage.
question just is, first of all, utilities, what happens to that? Secondly, do you need the waterproofing if you fill it?
Okay, so just to be clear, I've heard two things. I think what I just heard Rebecca say was that we would be filling in the entire basement.
That is the question.
Yes, that's the proposal for number one, as I read it, as Janelle read it, which was filling the entire garage.
Okay.
So from a structural standpoint, if you came back and filled that entire garage with concrete and pumped it up to the bottom of the slab, yes, that would support the slab and it would support the retaining walls. But you have to think about all the utilities, all the MEP. That's where all the utilities come into the building. That's where like the electrical rooms are. And I'm structural, so I can only speak to the structural side. But if you think about all those utilities and things down there, I'm not sure how that works. The other thing I would be concerned about is if you think about it, if you came back and filled that whole garage with concrete, let's just say that's 10 feet tall. You know how heavy all that concrete is? That basically is going to make that building want to settle more because you're adding so much additional load to that building.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks.
And sorry, just
would you be able to waterproof?
Correct.
Do you need to
So
waterproof
back
it?
to the waterproofing. If you come up with a solution that basically sufficiently supported the whole slab and all the basement walls, then theoretically you wouldn't have to worry about the waterproofing. But then what I'd worry about is you still have all these PT cables that are going to start failing. And so what happens when those cables fail? And so if those cables fail and they break, we could have they pop on the end, they could pop up. There's lots of ways these cables can fail, and so that's the next concern.
Rebecca, go ahead. I mean, Ryan, I'm getting a little tired.
No, just thank you. I think that clarified it for myself. I can't speak for the other commissioners.
I guess I still have one point of clarification. I think the three of us all read it in somewhere, and maybe this isn't true, but not as concrete, but as some sort of compacted soil that would fill it, in which case then maybe you wouldn't have the massive weight issue, but I understand there would still be the issues you've suggested with utilities and possible waterproofing.
Hi again. So for those of you who've actually seen soil when you compact it, you'll see like there's called the sheep's foot and it rolls on top. The problem is when you're constrained from the bottom and the sides and the top, there's really no way to actually effectively compact the soil. We had this discussion with the general contractor saying, for one of the other options, that, hey, is there any way you can think of to compact this soil? There's really not a known way of compacting the soil. When you compact soil, you do it in lifts. You don't just throw a bunch of dirt in the hole. You basically go 12-inch lift, you compact it, 12-inch lift, you compact it. And so there's no way to really get that upper layer to compaction.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay. So I think we're at that point where we have asked the questions to the engineer and to the city staff. We have had a discussion. We have given our personal reasons if we support the appellant or if we support the permit. Unless anybody has a different idea or another option, I think it is now time to make a motion and then, I'm sorry, we can't have, it's not a raise your hand type of thing. And then we should have a vote on the issue.
I just had one other comment, if that's okay.
Please.
So-
And if anybody has a comment,
It strikes me that there could be other reasons that we haven't discussed for options 1 and 2, and we just heard about the structural implications, but to understand how those are in I think it's orange or red color, which indicates that they're violating some laws or codes. But I do think something that, at least as my point of view, and I feel like I'm hearing it from other commissioners, is that I think there's a question about not the value of the parking to the building owner, but the value of parking to the community versus the value of the trees to the community. And I think I hope that this is something that we can consider if we can't solve that tonight, which I don't know that we can, but that we can consider as we move forward with the Heritage Tree Task Force and things like that. Because I think it's important to think about how our community values the trees and values the urban canopy in our environment, and how is that at tension with valuing parking and how we might solve issues like this. Aside from all the other implications, I'm sure there are other laws and codes, as we mentioned, with utilities, et cetera, but I think as we look ahead, I think it's very important to consider how parking and the environment and the natural habitat are there tensions there, and is there something we should discuss?
Thank you, Ryan. Does anybody else on the commission have a general comment that they'd like to make?
I'll just make a quick comment. This is a situation where we all kind of feel like we're losing. So it's hard and we get to be the lucky ones to be deciding this, which I say that very sarcastically. But I want to first thank the owner because he planted these beautiful trees and we've enjoyed them for 40 years. It's not his fault that he planted them in the wrong place. Any of us could do it, so please I really want to refrain from that thinking. I thank him for the trees. He's taken excellent care of them. To all the citizens, I mean, I hear you, everything you've said about the value of the trees. It's not $1. In fact, I get insulted when I see $1 value. That really turned my stomach. I would actually say don't even include that next time, just wrong move. It's not really something that anybody feels good about. Before I make my vote, I also want to just say that I do believe still that there is a small compromise that can be made, and I would just ask that you sharpen your pencil a little bit more, and please just see if you can consider there are at least by my value there's trees 7 through 10 that if some surgical like smaller trenching could be done in those one specific areas instead of an all or nothing approach, I would really encourage you to do that. I think it would go a long way in the community. I think it would say a lot about our city and our that we stand behind that tree emblem that's on our sign, right? So I would just really encourage you to think through that because even whatever happens tonight, you're still in the position to make some decisions with your plan. And so that's all I'll say on that.
Anyone else? And I would say one more thing. Earlier, I was looking into the idea of maybe doing the waterproofing in 2 phases. One would be using the current walkway as a divider, and when the cables were pulled out, as we discussed, we'd find the owner and the engineers would find where the leak would apparently would be. They would then, if they had done the Jeffrey's hamburger side of the landscaping or removed the landscaping, that would encompass taking out 4 trees. But if they found the leak was in that area, they repair it and then put waterproofing on that side. But through our discussion tonight, I have found that the joint between an old and a new waterproofing would be like lifting up the covers, apparently. You wouldn't have a good seal between the 2 materials. And that would mean that if you didn't have a leak there, if you cut a line between the old and new, then you're creating a new place where there's leaks. So that was an idea I had earlier today, and I discussed it. And personally, that does not seem like an option. So like what Deb has said, this process, it's amazing to find out that there's so many people who care about Menlo Park, care about our trees, care about our safety. I am just glad that I can be a part of Menlo Park in some way, but I hope that we can learn from all our experiences. And one thing is, I think we are going to be more wise when it comes to where to plant trees in locations. Thank you. Now, anybody else? That's it. One more. Okay, Janelle, please.
I thank you all for being here and for your thoughtful comments. And I just have to say that I feel like we're better than this. Like, what we're coming down to is I can tell we're about to axe some trees because we couldn't get creative enough about a solution. And I really resent the fact that in 50 years, we're going to face the same problem with trees that are twice as big.
Please.
I think the owner should not have to bear the burden of this. I think the burden should be split around. For the right price, they will agree to share that parking with you. I know they will. And if the city had to kick in something for that, I just feel like there could be a solution there. So I feel like, come on, we're better than this. We've got Stanford, we've got Berkeley, we've got all sorts of engineers. Why can we not figure this thing out? I'm very disappointed.
Hold on the applause, please. Please, no comment. Okay. I am going to make a motion that we vote on supporting the staff's recommendation to have these 7 heritage trees along El Camino at 1,000 El Camino. We support that motion, that action, and approve the removal of the trees. Anybody? That's my motion. Anybody like to second that motion? I second it. All right, a second by Tom. Are we ready to vote? All right. We have buttons on. We have not been here before. We have buttons on the little microphone stand. We will press whatever button we want, and that will be our vote. So,
I don't think we have the.
So all those.
Is it gonna? No, it's not going to work. Sorry.
Oh, we have to say it.
Oh.
Yeah.
Okay, we'll raise our hands.
Again, just to be clear, for the record, because this is being taped. So it's to
support.
Deny. So about the appeal.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. Yeah. Deny the appeal and support staff's recommendation to remove the 7 heritage redwood trees on 1,000 El Camino. All right. All those in favor of denying the appellant and supporting the permit that by staff's recommendation, raise your hand. All those in favor of not supporting the recommendation, raise your hand. All right, we have voted. Okay, so that concludes this part of our meeting, but as I had said, there is a 15-day appeal period, and you can, I'm not sure if that means it will be scheduled in 15 days, but you have 15 days to notify the city if you want to appeal our discussion. Thank you very much. I appreciate everybody's time, especially Greg. Thank you. And we actually... we are moving on with our meeting. Let me just check what, I think we have to approve the minutes from the previous month. Let me check the agenda, please. Oh, I'm sorry. Of course, we are going to take we'll take a short break for refreshing our